Around 3 a.m. on September 5th, 1981, a woman drove through a housing development in Lakeland, Florida. She was with two of her friends who had agreed to spend the night with her at her duplex. And this was a huge relief to this woman, because yesterday there had actually been a violent murder in their neighborhood. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right show, because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Follow Button's house and hide open cans of tuna fish in all their vents, and then turn the heat on. Just before 8 p.m. on September 3rd, 1981, 31-year-old Linda Slayton stood in her kitchen in Lakeland, Florida, staring into her cupboard. It was almost completely empty, except for a few cans of beans and a bag of flour. And seeing this gave Linda a pit in her stomach, because she knew she would somehow have to turn these sparse ingredients into a meal for her kids. Linda was a single mother of two boys, Jeff, who was 15, and Tim, who was 12. And Linda didn't have very much money. And so in order to take care of her kids, she had to be resourceful, like, finding a way to make food with whatever ingredients she had, and she also would make her kids their own clothing, anything to save money. Now, up until a few weeks ago, the family had lived in Alabama, but Linda had moved to Lakeland specifically because she had a lot of family and support there. And so Linda had hoped that, because of that support, that, her and her son's lives would, improve quite a bit. It wouldn't feel like such a struggle all the time anymore. But so far, the move to Lakeland had just been more of the same. Linda couldn't find a steady job, so she and the boys had been relying on government assistance and food stamps, which never seemed to be enough to keep these two teenagers well fed. And tonight, Linda's youngest son, Tim, was about to be dropped off after being at football practice. And historically, he was very hungry after practice, and so she really wanted to have dinner ready for him. And on top of that, Linda was hopeful that Tim and her other son, Jeff, would eat fast enough that they would have enough time to make it to a neighbor's housewarming party later that night. So all the neighbors around Linda were basically as new as she was, since the complex they lived in had only been open for about 3 weeks. It was the sprawling development with about 80 one-story duplexes that were technically government-subsidized housing, but it felt more like classic suburbia, since the units were on cul-de-sacs with neat lawns where all the kids would go outside and play. Now, Linda's sister also lived in this complex, so Linda already knew at least one person. But to Linda, making friends of her own was also pretty important to her. She was an outgoing person by nature. And also, she was newly single and wanted to take her mind off her ex-boyfriend. Until recently, Linda had been dating this guy named Brendan Fowler, who had been great at first and was even the one who told her about this apartment complex. But he'd started to get really controlling and possessive, and just 2 days ago, Linda had finally ended things. But believe it or not, Linda actually felt sort of hopeful. She had believed that by leaving Alabama and moving to Florida into this complex, that would sort of be the refresh that she and her kids desperately needed. But the truth was, it sort of seemed like actually the true reset had been the breakup with Brendan just a couple of days earlier. Like it all needed to happen, all this big change in order for their lives to really get on the right track. And so, feeling optimistic, Linda looked into the cupboard at her limited ingredients and suddenly realized she could actually do a quick bean casserole with just these couple of things. So she grabbed the cans and the flour, and she got started. About a half an hour later, Linda pulled a beautiful golden brown casserole out of the oven and set it on the counter to cool. And that's when her older son, Jeff, wandered into the kitchen to see if dinner was ready. Linda told him it was, but they needed to wait for Tim to get home from football first. And when she said that, Jeff sort of blew up at her. He said he was really hungry right now, and there was basically no food in the house, and so he couldn't even eat anything else to tide himself over, come on, let me eat. Now, Jeff's reaction made Linda pretty mad, but at the same time, it didn't really surprise her. Jeff had been talking back to her a lot lately, and the two of them seemed to fight all the time. Linda knew he was sort of just being a typical teenager, and he was really hungry, and so he's testing her limits. But she was just getting really sick of it. And so before she could even really think about it, she snapped back at him and said, "Well, if you don't like it here, you can leave." And at that, Jeff literally stormed out of the house and slammed the door behind him. Linda went to the window and watched her son pick up his bike and pedal off down the road. After that, Linda sighed and walked over to her phone and called her mom. She assumed, Jeff, her son, would go to her parents' house since they lived nearby. And when Linda's mother picked up, Linda warned her that Jeff might be there soon, and he'd likely want to eat. Her mom said that was fine, and they would drop him back off after dinner. Then, her mom said she actually was glad that Linda called, because another letter came. And as soon as Linda heard that, she felt this wave of anxiety come over her, because she knew what kind of letter she was talking about. So Linda's ex-husband and Tim and Jeff's dad, Frank Slayton, lived back in Alabama. He was a violent, abusive alcoholic, and they'd been divorced for 7 years. But Frank had never stopped harassing Linda after they broke up. And since Linda and the boys had moved to Lakeland, he had been mailing threatening letters to Linda's parents, saying that Linda had ruined his life. And so now Linda was thinking, like, no matter how many fresh starts she started, that Frank was always going to screw them up. He was never going to go away. And so after taking a calming breath, Linda told her mom on the phone to just rip the letter up. She didn't even want to read it. Not long after she hung up, her younger son, Tim, came in the front door. He was all sweaty and dirty from football practice, and right away, Linda asked him, "Hey, did you thank your coach for giving you a ride home?" And Tim said, "Yes, I did." So Linda, she didn't have a car because she couldn't afford one. And so Tim's coach always had to give him a ride, but Tim said, I thanked him like always. And so Linda told him to hurry up and eat because they had to go next door to the neighbor's party. Hours later, after 11 p.m. that evening, Linda and Tim walked home from the party through the dark apartment complex. There were 7 other people who had been at the party, and it had been a lot of fun. Everybody just drank iced tea and played cards while they talked about the perks of living in this great new complex, like the great business district across the street and how responsive the maintenance team was. So Linda was glad they went. She was also exhausted, and her sister always came over for coffee in the morning, so she needed to go to bed now or she would never wake up. However, when she and Tim got back to their unit and opened up the door, Linda froze because there was already somebody inside. For a second, she thought it might be an intruder, but then she realized it was actually just her older son, Jeff, who had come back. He was standing in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a sort of "I'm sorry" expression on his face. Tim saw the situation and immediately disappeared into the second bedroom to give his mother and brother some space. Linda went to join Jeff in the kitchen, but Jeff didn't say anything. So Linda spoke first and reminded him that it was not good to go to bed angry. However, Jeff still didn't say anything. And Linda knew from experience with her son, it was better not to force Jeff to talk. So she decided she would just give Jeff a minute, and she began washing the dishes. Finally, after a few moments, Jeff mumbled that he loved his mom, and Linda smiled. She felt relieved they could just move on from this. She said it was all good and that she loved him too. Then they both said goodnight, and Jeff went over to the cot in the living room where he slept, and then Linda wrapped up in the kitchen, turned off the lights, and headed into her own bedroom, closed the door, and she went to bed too. The next morning at 8:30 a.m., Linda's sister, Judy Butler, walked up to Linda's duplex. They'd had coffee together every morning since they moved to the neighborhood, so Judy expected to knock on her sister's door and go right in like she always did. But this time after she knocked, nobody answered. So Judy waited and then knocked again. And when there was still no response, Judy reached down and tried to open up the door, but she found it was locked. This had never happened before. Linda always answered the door, or at least called out in response. But Judy wasn't really worried. She just assumed, that Linda must have overslept or something. So Judy decided she would just go home for now and let her sister have a few minutes, and eventually she would call to check in on her and make sure she was okay. However, as she walked away from the home, she noticed something strange on the side of Linda's house. One of the back windows was missing a screen, and Judy knew that that particular room was Linda's bedroom, and it hadn't been like that yesterday. So seeing it now made her feel kind of uneasy, and so she went over to look inside. And when she looked inside, she saw her sister fast asleep in bed. And for a second, Judy was relieved, because this confirmed that this is all this was. Her sister had overslept, that's that. But then Judy realized there was something off about Linda, like the way she was positioned just seemed wrong. And when everything clicked for her, she staggered backwards and began to scream. By 9 a.m. on September 4th, 1981, A crowd of reporters and police officers surrounded the duplex in a Lakeland, Florida housing complex where a woman had reported seeing a dead body. In the middle of all the activity, Sergeant Edgar Pickett of the Lakeland Police ducked under some crime scene tape and headed to the home's walkway with a bag of equipment slung over his shoulder. So Pickett was actually just a year away from retirement after 2 decades as a detective, and for the last few years, he'd been the head of Lakeland's crime scene unit, which meant he oversaw the collection and documentation of evidence at crime scenes. And so he wasn't the lead investigator on this case, but when it came to forensic analysis and fingerprint collection, he was the best they had. He'd already been briefed on the situation and knew that this was very likely a homicide, and the victim had been identified as 31-year-old Linda Slayton. Linda had been found in her bedroom by her sister, who had asked a nearby maintenance worker to call 911. Pickett also knew that when the first responder got inside the house, they found that Linda's 2 kids were still asleep and appeared to have no idea their mother was deceased in the next room, which Pickett knew would give investigators somewhat of a timeline to start with. Linda was clearly awake when her kids went to sleep and must have died sometime during the night while her kids were still sleeping. As Pickett walked up the walkway, he passed by 2 teenage boys sitting in their pajamas on the ground. He assumed these must be the sons, and one of them just sort of stared ahead, seemingly in complete shock, while the other sort of sobbed into his brother's shoulder. Pickett wasn't sure if anybody had spoken to them yet, but he knew they would likely be really helpful in focusing his search for evidence. Since they lived in the house, they'd know the habits and patterns of everybody who lived there, and might be able to tell him if anything seemed out of place. So Pickett made a mental note to make sure to check in with the investigators inside about that. Then he looked at the house and took a deep breath. Pickett liked to get a sort of first impression of the crime scene before he did any actual collections. So before he would go in, he would walk around the entire house and sort of assess the building. He had been told that all the doors were locked when the police first got there. And from what he could see, the bedroom window with the missing screen was the only sign of a potential break-in. So he took out his kit and spent some time dusting around that window area for prints. But he didn't find much there, or any noticeable shoe impressions in the dirt outside. And then when he finally headed inside, Pickett quickly moved past all the officers and detectives that were already in there and went straight to the bedroom. And the first thing he saw when he got inside was Linda's body on the bed with a metal coat hanger wrapped around her throat. The sheets around her were covered in blood, and she was shirtless, and the bottom of her dress was pulled up. And when Pickett got closer, he saw where the blood had come from. There were long, very deep scratches on Linda's neck, which he guessed were from her nails as she tried to pry the hanger away. He'd have to wait for the autopsy, but it was clear from her wounds that the hanger had been used to strangle her. And considering she was partially naked and the positioning of her clothes, he guessed she had also been likely sexually assaulted. Pickett stepped back and looked around the room, trying to decide where to start. He needed to find as much forensic evidence in this room as possible, so the first thing he did was try and guess what happened and how the killer might have interacted with the crime scene. That way, he could follow their sort of imagined path with more intention. He figured the killer must have come in through the open window, since that was the only entrance into the house that was obviously tampered with. Linda's purse and jewelry were still on the dresser, and the drawers were all closed, as opposed to open and rifled through, so it didn't seem like the killer had touched any of that stuff, which also meant this likely was not a robbery gone wrong. In fact, it seemed like the first and only thing the killer had done was come in through the window and attack Linda, because aside from the bloody bed, Pickett didn't see any signs of a struggle. So Linda was likely caught off guard by a very fast attack and unable to really fight back quickly, because if she did, the room would be a huge mess. But then Pickett caught a glimpse of Linda's closet, and he noticed the clothes were all hanging on metal hangers that looked identical to the one that was around Linda's neck. And that's when it hit him. The killer must have at some point been in the closet, hiding. He supposed the killer could have broken in first and then grabbed a hanger once the attack started, but that would have taken too much time and also given Linda a chance to get off the bed or fight back or yell out and maybe wake her sons up. It was much more likely that the killer had broken in earlier, hid in the closet, and then waited until Linda was in her bed asleep to come out and attack. If Pickett was right about that, this became definitely a premeditated, thought-out murder. which meant the killer must have either known Linda personally or had been watching her, since they would have known when to sneak into the room and not be detected. At this point, Pickett took out his gear and began thinking how he was going to begin looking for evidence. He figured he would start at the window and spend some time there, and then he would go to the closet. Those would be his two primary areas. And so once he had that plan in mind, he went to the window and he began looking for evidence, and sure enough, after only a few minutes of dusting, he smiled. Because there, on the ledge, was a very clear, well-defined handprint. The following afternoon, over 24 hours after Linda's body had been found, Pickett sat in the precinct's fingerprint lab, comparing two sets of prints with a magnifying glass. He'd been at it for hours already, so his head was pounding. After processing the crime scene yesterday, Pickett had gone back to the station to review the evidence he'd collected. And while he was there, he decided he would go check in with the detectives to get an update on the case. And what they would tell him is they had spoken to the neighbors, as well as Linda's family, and they did have a few solid leads and a timeline. According to Linda's kids, the older son Jeff got dropped off at home at about 9:30 p.m. after being with his grandparents. And Tim, the younger son, and Linda had gotten back from a neighbor's party just after 11 p.m. They all went to bed around midnight, and neither of the brothers heard anything until the police woke them up the next morning. And all of this had led the investigators to agree with Pickett's initial interpretation of the scene, that Linda's attack was very fast. It seemed like she had not been able to even scream, or it would have woken up her sons. The autopsy report had also come in, and it confirmed Linda died from strangulation and was sexually assaulted. The medical examiner had also been able to collect semen from Linda's body, which meant they were definitely looking for a man here. And since this was now clearly a sexually motivated crime, it meant that anybody Linda had been romantically involved with was now suddenly a top suspect. After speaking with Linda's family, the detectives discovered that Linda had two serious ex-partners. She had her ex-husband, Frank Slayton, and an ex-boyfriend named Brendan Fowler. Frank apparently had abused Linda when they were married and still sent her very threatening letters. And Brendan was apparently very possessive with a bad temper, and Linda had broken up with him just 2 days before her murder. And so some officers were already out looking for both of these men, and Pickett was eager to get both of their prints. But for now, Pickett was actually more focused on Linda's neighbors. When the detectives had done their canvass initially, the neighbors they spoke to had confirmed that Linda and her younger son Tim were indeed at that party. And since these neighbors were some of the last people to see Linda alive, they weren't just witnesses, they were suspects. And so Pickett had collected fingerprints from all the men at that party who didn't have an alibi for the period of time after Linda went home. And that's what he was working on now, comparing those prints to the print he had found on the windowsill. So far, none were a match, but they had also gotten blood samples from the neighbors, and so Pickett would have to test those as well. So in 1981, DNA testing didn't exist yet, but investigators could figure out somebody's blood type through bodily fluids. So Pickett and his team could test those samples against the genetic material found on Linda's body and rule out suspects that way. But Pickett had another reason for wanting to be diligent when it came to testing the people who lived in the complex. It was because after Linda's murder, like in the last 24 hours, there had been signs that the killer might actually still be in the area. At 3 a.m. that morning, one of Linda's neighbors had called in to say a stranger had broken into her house. And even though that person was gone by the time the police arrived, they could see her back door had clearly been forced open. And then another neighbor had called in to say that the screen on their window was pried open as well. None of them were violent assaults like Linda's, but the timing was very suspicious. And it made Pickett wonder if there was a serial predator living in the complex. The department had ordered some patrols in the area, and Pickett was supposed to get fingerprints for whoever they got calls about. So he was working with his radio right next to him. Pickett leaned back in his chair to give his eyes a rest. He knew he was getting pretty tired and would need a break soon. But just seconds later, a detective barged into the lab and told Pickett they needed him on standby for fingerprinting because they just brought Linda's ex-boyfriend, Brendan, in for questioning. Moments later, Pickett was standing outside of an interrogation room, listening as some detectives spoke with Brendan Fowler inside. Even though he couldn't see Brendan, Pickett could tell by his voice that he was not happy to be here. He sounded argumentative and defensive, as he insisted he really had nothing to do with Linda's death. And when he was asked about where he was the night she died, he had an alibi. He said he was at home with his family, and he stayed there the whole night. He even gave detectives his mom's phone number and said they should call her to confirm it. Pickett heard the detectives confer in hushed voices. Then they asked Brendan if he'd be willing to take a polygraph test and let them take his fingerprints. And to Pickett's surprise, Brendan said, "Yeah, go ahead." And as soon as Pickett heard that, based on experience, he went right inside the room and got Brendan's fingerprints before Brendan could change his mind. On September 11th, so 1 week after Linda's murder, Pickett sat down at his desk and opened the newspaper, and what he saw made him cringe. The Lakeland police chief had just given an interview where he admitted they would not be making an arrest now or in the next few days. And reading that in print reminded Pickett of just how little they had in this case. None of the neighbors' prints had been a match to the one Pickett had lifted off the windowsill, and they'd tracked down Linda's ex-husband, Frank, but found that he was in Alabama on the night Linda was killed. As for Linda's ex-boyfriend, Brendan, he had seemed pretty guilty at first because during his polygraph, the results had been inconclusive, and his alibi didn't check out. His family had said he was home at one point on the night Linda was killed, but they all went to sleep and couldn't say for sure if maybe he left or not. But when Pickett had looked at his prints, he had no choice but to clear him, because they clearly were not a match. So now Pickett knew the entire investigative team was scrambling for leads, which was why Pickett was not surprised by what he saw when he looked up from his paper. He saw a detective leading a suspect out of a precinct interrogation room after clearly questioning him, and it was Linda's own 15-year-old son, Jeff Slayton, and he was obviously crying. Pickett had heard that Jeff was being looked into as a suspect in his mother's murder, and had already been questioned a few times. Detectives had started getting interested in him when a few of Linda's family members mentioned that, Jeff and Linda had been fighting a lot before she died. And when investigators looked back at the crime scene photos, they realized Jeff's cot in the living room shared a wall with Linda's room. So it was strange he hadn't heard anything on the night she had died. But as far as Pickett knew, Jeff had a reasonable explanation for all of this. He had said that he and his mother's fights were not that serious, and they did fight the night she died, but it was over some dumb argument over what time dinner was. And he said he had no idea why he didn't wake up when she was attacked, because he wished he had so he could have gone in there and helped her. And also Jeff had taken and passed a polygraph test. But for some reason, it seemed like the investigative team was not done with Jeff, and Pickett just sort of felt bad for the kid, because he thought it was very unlikely at this point that Jeff was his own mother's killer. Pickett had kids of his own, and from his own experience, the fights Jeff was having with his mom just seemed sort of like typical teenage behavior, squabbling with their parents. It's pretty normal. And it also just didn't line up with the evidence. Pickett was absolutely certain that the attacker broke in through the window, which didn't make sense for Jeff if he was sleeping right next door in the living room. And Pickett had personally checked Jeff's prints against the one he lifted from the window, and he knew it was not a match. As the days turned into weeks, Pickett was starting to become convinced that the killer might be somebody without a personal connection to Linda. Maybe it was even a stranger. He knew that murders by strangers were much more rare than murders committed by a relative, partner, or friend, which was why he assumed the detectives weren't pursuing it. But through his forensics, Pickett had now eliminated pretty much everybody in Linda's life who had a motive or opportunity to kill her. And Linda was a very attractive young woman who was very outgoing. Pickett thought it was possible the killer could be a stranger who had only interacted with her once and then sort of became fixated on her. It seemed possible. And so after Pickett watched Jeff leave, he tried to go back to the newspaper, but he kept thinking about Linda. He'd been sure this case would be solved quickly by forensics, but now he wasn't sure if it would be solved at all. And that worry only got stronger and stronger as the months went by and fewer leads came in. And before long, a whole year had passed, and it was actually time for Pickett to retire. And when he left the precinct for the last time, he sort of had a pit in his stomach, because he had a feeling that without him, Linda's case was going to get put on a shelf and forgotten. One afternoon in the fall of 2001, so 2 decades after Linda Slayton was murdered, Detective Brad Grice sat in his office at the Lakeland Police Department reading over Linda's cold case file. For the last 4 years, Grice had been sorting through the department's cold cases and choosing which ones to reopen. And this had been a really slow process, because he had to do that and juggle his active caseload. So even though he'd technically been working on Linda's case for years, he was just now starting to really dig into it. But the delay didn't worry him too much, since the whole reason this case appealed to him was because he was sure he could solve it quickly. Because it had DNA evidence. So back in 1981, when the murder actually happened, the genetic material that was found on Linda's body was only good for eliminating suspects through blood type. But now, in 2001, Grice could use that same material to create a full DNA profile of Linda's killer. And he intended on reaching out to everybody involved in the original investigation to get their DNA to test against this new profile. But before he did this, he wanted to familiarize himself with the suspects from 1981. So there was Linda's ex-husband, Frank Slayton, who had abused Linda repeatedly during their marriage. And even though they had been divorced for years, he was apparently still sending her all these threatening letters around the time of her murder. And then her more recent romantic partner, Brendan Fowler, was known to have a bad temper and seemed very controlling of Linda. And they broke up only 2 days before her murder, so he could have still been furious about it. The neighbors at the party Linda had gone to were also suspects. Everybody in that group knew when Linda was heading home, so somebody could have maybe followed her and then snuck into her bedroom before she went to bed. And then finally, Jeff Slayton, Linda's oldest son, was actually in the house during the murder. His brother Tim had been too, but Jeff actually admitted to getting in a big fight with Linda earlier that same day. Now, all of these suspects had been cleared through fingerprints, alibi, or polygraphs. But Grice knew that DNA testing was way more accurate than any of those methods of elimination. And so basically, even if they'd been ruled out for one of those 3 things, DNA overrode that. And so he wasn't going to let these previous eliminations cloud his judgment. He'd already decided that, basically no matter what, he was just going to focus on whatever the forensics told him and not be biased. But for now, he just wanted to kick things off by speaking with the 2 people who'd known Linda better than anybody else. Her sons, Tim and Jeff. A few days later, Grice walked into a meeting room at the precinct, where he'd been told Jeff and Tim Slayton were waiting. And as soon as he saw the brothers, he just started laughing, because he realized he knew Jeff Slayton. They had bowled together for years, but it hadn't occurred to Grice that this Jeff was that Jeff. And Jeff recognized Grice at the same time. So they spent a while talking and laughing about what a crazy coincidence this was. And so when Grice finally sat down with Jeff and with Tim at the same time, Grice's first line of questioning was actually just pretty emotional. It just was like, hey, how are you guys holding up after this horrible thing? And for the next few minutes, the mood got pretty heavy as the 2 brothers spoke honestly about how terrible the last 20 years had been. After their mother had been killed, they both said they were terrified that, they were going to get hurt too, because the killer was never caught. They felt like, who's next? Jeff said he slept with a knife under his pillow, and he eventually got so depressed he dropped out of high school. And Tim admitted he also struggled, but he took a different path. He relied on his football team and friends for support and kept pictures of all of them around his room to remind himself to stay positive. After that, the brothers shared what they could remember about the night their mother had died. But it was obvious to Grice that, Tim and Jeff didn't really have any information he didn't already have inside the case file. So instead of continuing to question them about details of the case, Grice explained that this murder was going to be solved through DNA. And because of that, he needed to collect samples from every person involved in this case, which included both of them. The brothers looked surprised for a moment, but then said, of course. So Grice stood up and said he would send a tech inside. But before he left, he promised them that he would find their mom's killer, and he was not going to retire until he did. Later that month, Grice sat in front of a screen in the station's computer lab, reading a police report from 1982. Since speaking to the 2 Slayton brothers, Grice had collected DNA from dozens of people who were involved in the case from 1981. Jeff, Tim, and also Linda's ex-husband Frank Slayton and her ex-boyfriend Brendan Fowler. He'd also tested the blood samples that the original investigators got from Linda's neighbors, but none of them matched the DNA profile for Linda's killer, which was disappointing because it meant that Grice had to basically start from scratch. But when he had gone back to the case notes, he noticed the mention of break-ins around the complex shortly after Linda's murder, and it made him wonder if Linda was killed by a serial predator who was in the area at the time. And if that was true, then this person would not have just hurt Linda, they would have other victims too. So Grice had run the killer's DNA through the FBI's database. And when it didn't match anything in there, he had reached out to the county sheriff's department to see if they could send him any cases that, felt similar to Linda's. And they had sent over the report that he was reading right now. And it felt incredibly promising. So in 1982, a year after Linda's murder, a man named Jimmy Ulmer was arrested for climbing through a 10-year-old girl's bedroom window, then assaulting and strangling her. And according to his file, Jimmy had this long history of home invasions and very violent behavior. And as soon as Grice finished reading the report, he jumped up and went to go find one of his officers. He wanted to dig up as much information on Jimmy as he possibly could, and see if maybe they could go track him down. About a month later, Grice sat at his desk, staring at his phone in anxious anticipation. He was waiting for an incredibly important call, one that would confirm whether Jimmy Ulmer was Linda's killer. After doing a background check on Jimmy, Grice had found out that Jimmy actually knew someone who lived at Linda's complex and was literally staying with them when Linda was killed. Now, Jimmy was not alive anymore, but they had gotten in touch with his mother, who gave them her DNA, which they were testing now. So this DNA would not be an exact match to the killer's DNA, but it would show if she was at least a relative to the killer. And as Grice waited for the lab to call, his heart was pounding. Because for the first time since he'd picked up Linda's case, everything finally made sense now. Jimmy was this violent serial home invader who had probably seen Linda while staying at his friend's house and maybe stalked her until he saw an opportunity to attack. And then after he killed her, he must have compulsively kept breaking into other homes to find more victims. Just then the phone rang and Grice picked it up, and he could feel his mouth going dry as he heard it was the lab on the other side. He was going to get an answer here. But just a second later, they told him it was not a match. Grice's stomach dropped, but he thanked them anyway, and he hung up. He couldn't believe it. Despite all the suspects and forensic evidence that they had, this case was once again at a dead end. Still, Grice kept pushing forward. As the months passed by, he would regularly find new suspects and eventually clear them. He also kept sending the killer's DNA profile to the FBI to run it through their database in case any new additions were, added in that could be a match. But eventually, over a decade passed by, and Grice still had not been able to match anybody to the killer's DNA. And in 2015, his own health began to decline, and he finally had to make the call he hoped he would never have to make. He picked up the phone and dialed Jeff Slayton's number. And when Jeff picked up, Grice said he did need to retire, and he still had not found his mother's killer. In June of 2019, 4 years into retirement, Grice sat on the deck of his Florida home reading a newspaper. He was deep in an article when his cell phone rang. And when he looked at the ID, he was surprised to see it was from the Lakeland Police Department. He had not gotten a call from them in years, so he immediately picked it up to see what they wanted. And when he did, the person on the other end introduced himself as the detective who had taken over the Linda Slayton case. The detective said they knew Grice was retired now, but they figured he would want to hear this. They said they had hired a genetic genealogist to track down family members of the killer based on the DNA profile that Grice had ordered. And through that process, they had finally been able to get a match. And after they did, they also managed to get the suspect's fingerprints. And those prints did match the palm print that the head of the crime scene unit, Sergeant Edgar Pickett, had taken at the original crime scene 38 years earlier. Grice sat up and listened intently as the detective finally told him who Linda's killer actually was. And when he heard the name, he couldn't believe it. That suspect had been so close the whole time. Based on DNA, forensic evidence, and 38 years of police investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Linda Slayton in the early morning hours of September 4th, 1981. The house was all quiet. as the killer waited patiently inside of Linda's closet. Hours earlier, when Linda was out, the killer had removed that screen from her bedroom window and crept inside, and then they had hid in this closet until she had come home. The killer had been watching Linda for a while now and finding ways to get close to her and her family, but Linda never really acknowledged them or paid any attention to them at all. Tonight, though, the killer was determined to show Linda that she was not the one in control. They were. And now, the killer stood in the dark closet, holding their breath as their heart pounded, and as they listened to Linda open her bedroom door and walk inside. And the killer continued to wait anxiously as they listened to the sound of Linda getting ready for bed and getting changed, and then eventually they heard the sound of the springs of the bed compressing as Linda laid down to shut her eyes for the night. And then after the killer was sure Linda was in bed, the lights are off, it's quiet in the room, they waited even longer just to make sure Linda was asleep and her children were asleep. And then finally, when the killer felt like they had waited long enough, they grabbed a coat hanger off the hook in the closet and then burst out of the door. And then before Linda could do anything, make a sound, even react, she's totally caught off guard, the killer was on top of her and had wrapped the coat hanger around her throat. Linda struggled and clawed at her throat to try to get this thing off of her, but the killer was so much stronger than her, and there was nothing she could do. It didn't take long for the killer to have their way with Linda, and then after they were done, they strangled her until she was dead. And once the killer was done, they hopped off the bed and just climbed right back out the same window they had come in through and wandered off into the night. And the killer would get to replay this crime over and over in their head all day the next day until it was time for football practice. It would turn out Linda was murdered by her son's football coach, Joseph Mills. Joseph was a fixture in Tim's life and would drive him to and from practice every day because Linda didn't have a car. But while Tim saw Joseph as a mentor in his life, Joseph had apparently just developed a total fixation on his mother. And during all those trips to her house to drop off her son, Joseph was planning out how and when to attack her. Back in 1981, Joseph was interviewed by police over the phone a day after Linda's murder, but he was never really considered an actual suspect. Instead, after Joseph murdered Linda, he just continued to drive her son Tim to and from football practice, and Tim would even very tragically begin to rely on Joseph for, emotional support, grieving the loss of his mother. But it's to her killer. He just didn't know. And then even more tragically, as time went on and Linda's case went cold, one of the pictures on an early morning in December of 1991, a woman living in Largo, Florida, woke up to the sound of pounding on her front door. And as she climbed out of her bed, she realized it was not just pounding on her door she was hearing. Also, whoever was out there was screaming for help. When the woman realized there was some sort of crisis here, she kind of rushed and ran to the front door. She opened it up, and standing out on the front porch was her neighbor. And she was practically covered head to toe in blood. Her head was covered in gashes. Her throat clearly had been slit. But before this woman could say what was even going on, she just fell to the ground and passed out. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button is taking a well-deserved. On the evening of December 14th, 1991, a 31-year-old man named Keith Young grabbed his car keys from a hook by the front door of his home in Largo, Florida. Behind him, his wife, Anita, slipped on her favorite pair of heels. The newlywed couple was about to head out on a much-needed date night. They were both actually on their second marriages, and they had 6 children between them from their previous relationships. So naturally, it was pretty hard to find time for just themselves. But that particular night, Keith's 2 kids were staying with their mother, who had shared custody, and Anita's 8-year-old daughter was at a sleepover, and her 12-year-old son Jason had agreed to stay home and watch his 2 younger siblings so that the adults could go out for dinner. Before they left, Keith gave Jason a final rundown of his expectations. Don't make too much of a mess, make sure nobody gets hurt, and if there was an emergency, he'd written down the restaurant's phone number on a notepad in the kitchen. But Keith reminded Jason that if there were like a real emergency, like a true crisis, he should call 911 right away. And when he heard this, Jason, the 12-year-old, just kind of rolled his eyes and said, "Yeah, I got it. It's under control." Now, Keith knew he was actually being a little bit uptight here, but there'd been an attempted break-in at their house earlier that year, and he'd been on edge about leaving the kids home alone ever since. The intruder had actually cut their phone lines and then also taken off a window screen, and they'd also tried to break down a door as well. But they'd actually left without taking anything, and there hadn't been any more issues in the months since. But critically, the suspect was never caught, so it felt kind of unresolved and scary for the family. Keith and Anita both hugged Jason goodbye as they walked out the door. And then once the door closed behind them, Keith turned around and checked the handle to double check that he'd locked it, just to be safe. Less than a half hour later, Keith and Anita sat down across from each other at the restaurant and unfolded their napkins onto their laps. They were excited to have a few hours of peace and quiet, where they could just, focus on each other, something that didn't happen very often. The couple had gotten married earlier that year after meeting at a support group for single parents, and they were very grateful to have each other, because their previous marriages were really not that great. Anita's ex-husband, Luther Bass, had a violent temper, and even though he now lived all the way across the country in Idaho, he still found a way to always complicate Anita's life. That summer, Luther had driven all the way to Keith and Anita's house to take his kids on a vacation, which Anita had initially agreed to, but when he showed up, he was unexpectedly driving a camper with his new girlfriend and her kids. And at that point, Anita had gotten a really bad feeling about the whole situation, and she actually started to worry that Luther would take her kids and then refuse to give them back. And so they had this big argument, and it got so bad that actually Anita had threatened to call the police before Luther finally backed off and left. Meanwhile, Keith had been having equally heated arguments with his ex-spouse, Linda, about whether their kids would spend the upcoming holidays with him or with Linda and her new husband, Steve. Things had gotten so nasty that Linda had actually recently begun harassing Anita over the phone and was also gearing up to go to court and try to get the custody agreement changed if Keith wouldn't agree to do things her way. But their bad relationships with their exes only made Keith more happy that he'd found Anita. He was glad that he could take care of her and her kids the way he felt like they deserved. So despite all the tension hanging over them, he tried to keep the mood light, and they enjoyed a very nice dinner. And then when the check came, Keith glanced at his watch and realized it was getting pretty late. He knew Anita's son Jason was a responsible kid and that he could definitely handle getting his younger siblings into bed, but Keith was still a bit worried about leaving the kids alone for too long. So he paid the check right away, and then he and Anita left the restaurant and drove home. A little while later, Keith and Anita pulled up outside of their brown single-story home. When they got inside, Keith was relieved to see that all the kids were calmly watching TV in the living room, and the family cat was curled up on the couch right next to them. Keith told them that it was time to get ready for bed. And as 12-year-old Jason got up, Keith pulled him in for a big hug and told him he was proud of him for his hard work babysitting. Anita helped the younger kids brush their teeth, and then afterwards, Keith turned off the lights, and he went down the hall and said goodnight to all three kids, who slept in bunk beds in the same room. Then, after that, he continued down the hallway to the main bedroom and climbed into bed with Anita. He kissed his wife goodnight and then turned off the light. Several hours later, around 3 a.m. early the next morning, Anita's 12-year-old son Jason awoke to a very loud noise, and when he heard it, he sat up in bed. And then he could hear something thumping around in the room next to him. But before he could figure out what was going on, someone screamed. With his vision still blurry from sleep, Jason slid off the top bunk and walked over to the door and cracked it open. And in the dark hallway, he could quickly make out the shadowy shapes of what appeared to be two men moving around, sort of struggling with each other, fighting. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized that one of these men was his stepdad, Keith, but he couldn't make out anything about the other man, except that he was really big and wearing what appeared to be a black ski mask. Jason immediately felt paralyzed by fear, because he knew, this was obviously another intruder, just like the one who'd tried to break into their house that summer. For a second, he was hopeful that maybe his stepdad would fend the man off, but then Jason noticed there was blood sprayed all over the walls. And then he saw the glint of a knife in the intruder's hand. The intruder had Keith pinned to the ground and was stabbing him over and over again. At the same moment, Jason saw his mother, Anita, run out of the master bedroom, also covered in blood, and she was holding a baseball bat. and she swung it at the intruder, and she hit him in the back of the head, but it barely slowed him down. And that's when Jason heard his stepdad yell out for Anita to get the gun. And Anita, she ran into another room, and Jason just stood there looking out the crack, just paralyzed with shock, watching as this intruder literally picked Keith up and threw him back into the master bedroom. And the next thing Jason knew, he saw his mother standing in the hallway holding a gun, and the intruder was running away out the front door. Suddenly, Jason kind of snapped out of the shocked trance he had found himself in and remembered what Keith had told him to do in case of a real emergency. Call 911. So he ran to the phone in the kitchen, he picked it up, and he dialed. But when he put the receiver to his ear, all he heard was silence. There was no dial tone. Jason looked over and he saw his mother kind of hobbling over towards him. She was standing in the doorway, and there was blood visibly dripping down her neck. Jason's voice cracked when he told his mother that the phone line was dead. Anita told her son to go back with his stepdad and just wait, that she was going to go find help. And so Jason began to walk towards the bedroom where he knew his stepdad was, and as he did, he watched his mom run out the front door into the night. And then Jason, he went down the hallway and went into the bedroom where he saw his stepdad sprawled out on the bed. And he was still alive, but he was clearly struggling to breathe. He's kind of gasping and, gurgling. And Jason, this 12-year-old kid, not having any idea how to handle this, just walked over to the bed, kneeled down, and he took Keith's hand and just held it while he waited for his mom. And as he held Keith's hand, he could hear the sound of his stepfather take his last few raspy breaths before he went completely limp. Several hours later, before dawn on the morning of December 15th, 1991, Detective Mike Short from the Largo Police Department pulled up to the curb outside of a brown single-story house surrounded by crime scene tape. He'd gotten a call from his supervisor, who really didn't know much, just that an intruder had broken into this house and attacked a husband and wife while they slept. But now, as Short got out of his car and looked around at the quiet block of modest, well-kept houses, he found that kind of odd. This really wasn't a neighborhood where they saw violent home invasions. As Short walked up to the house, a uniformed officer caught up with him and gave him a few more details about what they knew so far. He said that the wife, Anita Young, had run to a neighbor's house screaming for help before passing out from blood loss in their front yard, and the husband, Keith Young, was deceased in the bedroom. The officer also said that the couple's 12-year-old son had woken up at some point and witnessed the attack. And for now, he was over at the neighbor's house until they could track down another guardian. The officer said that Anita had been taken to a hospital, but it would be a miracle if she survived. Her injuries were some of the worst they'd ever seen. As Short went up the walkway that led to the front door, he saw that blood had dripped all over the cement. The front door was open, and right inside he saw a baseball bat lying on the floor with blood on the handle. Short stepped inside, and he saw more blood. Blood that was spattered and smeared basically all over the living room, on the walls, the doors, the furniture, as if the suspect and the victims had been fighting all throughout the house. In fact, it was so chaotic and messy that Short thought maybe the suspect was not expecting to fight off two grown adults. Otherwise, they might have come up with a better plan of attack. So Short's first assumption was that this likely was a robbery that had gone terribly wrong. As he continued down the hallway, a cat ran past him. It was unharmed, and it went to hide under the couch. The hallway was somewhat unbelievably even bloodier than the living room, with red smears all over the walls and floors, so Short figured most of the attack must have occurred here. Short reached the main bedroom and looked inside, and he saw Keith's body lying on the bed, covered head to toe in blood. Keith's shirt was shredded, and Short could see there were multiple stab wounds to his chest and also a very deep gash down his side. Short decided not to actually go into the bedroom until crime scene techs had gone through it for forensic evidence. So instead, he just walked down the rest of the hallway and pushed open the door to another bedroom, where he was surprised to see two small children soundly asleep in their bunk beds. Somehow, these kids had slept through the entire attack. Short went back outside and immediately flagged down a uniformed officer, and he told him to go in there and wake up those kids and bring them somewhere safe. Then, once the officer went inside, Short pulled out his flashlight and began searching the yard for evidence. Based on Keith's wounds, at least what he saw, Short thought he was probably attacked with a knife, or maybe even an axe or a machete. But apart from that bloody baseball bat that was found in the doorway, there was no sign of a weapon anywhere inside or outside of the house. But as Short went around the side of the house, he found something else that was interesting. The home's phone lines had clearly been cut. The killer must have planned ahead to make sure nobody in this house could call out for help. And this was interesting because nothing else about the scene suggested that this crime was carefully planned. In fact, in some ways, you could say it looked like it was very unplanned. But now, Short had to consider that maybe this was not just a random robbery gone wrong. Maybe, especially given the cut phone lines, this was like a premeditated attack, a premeditated murder. And if that was the case, he had to figure out who the intended target was: Keith or Anita or both. A little while later, Detective Short walked up the street to the neighbor's house to speak with his best eyewitness, Anita's 12-year-old son, Jason. After Short knocked on the door, the neighbors let him inside and showed him into their living room, where he saw Jason was wrapped in a blanket and still wearing his pajamas. Short sat down across from him and told him that he knew it must be extremely difficult to talk about this, but he really needed to know exactly what he had seen and what he had heard during this attack. Tears began to roll down Jason's face as he began to describe watching his mother and stepfather fight off this intruder. Jason said he couldn't really describe what this person looked like because they were wearing a ski mask, but he was pretty sure it was a man. He also said there had been a little bit of skin exposed on the killer's neck, and from the looks of it, it appeared like their skin was maybe fairly dark, so Short wrote down that the suspect likely had dark skin. But because it was dark, and Jason clearly had not gotten a very good look at the killer, he knew the boy could be wrong too. So he was just putting it down as a maybe. Short asked Jason if the intruder had said anything during the attack, and Jason just shook his head and said no. He said the intruder didn't say a single word the entire time. And Short made note of that too, because it made him wonder if maybe the killer was someone close to the family, and they knew that if they spoke, someone might recognize their voice, like Jason. Later that same morning, once the sun had come up, Short went back to Keith and Anita's house and searched the outside of the property again, in case he missed anything when it was dark. And while he was searching the front yard, another police cruiser pulled up to the curb. An officer got out and walked over to Short. She asked if he was the lead investigator on this case, and when he said he was, the officer told him that she'd been waiting at the hospital all morning and Anita had finally woken up enough to say a few words. She said Anita was only awake for just a few minutes before she had to be rushed back into surgery, but it was long enough to answer a couple of questions. Anita had described waking up to see a man standing over her with an axe in one hand and a knife in the other. She said it was a man that she had never seen before. She didn't recognize anything about him. The officer said right before Anita was taken off to surgery, there was one more thing she mentioned. There had been an attempted break-in at their house earlier that year, and the intruder, during that break-in, had also cut their phone lines. Short instinctively turned and literally looked at the side of the house where those lines had been cut, and he thought to himself, this is too strange of a coincidence to be ignored. Later that day, back at the station, Short read through reports on the interviews his team had done with Keith and Anita's kids and their neighbors. A team of 5 detectives had been assigned to this case, and they'd made quick progress on collecting background information on the victims. Everybody in the neighborhood had described the victims as being a very normal, happy couple. Keith was an air conditioning technician who'd been working at the same company for a very long time, and Anita was mostly a stay-at-home mom who did some accounting work on the side. However, what also came out in these interviews was that both Keith and Anita had ex-spouses who could potentially want to hurt them. Anita's ex-husband, Luther, lived thousands of miles away in Boise, Idaho, but Short knew that despite the distance, it was not impossible that he might have traveled to Florida to commit this crime. So Short called the Boise police and told them about this attack, and asked them to track down Luther and question him. As for Keith's ex-wife, Linda, Short had learned that she actually lived right there in town, and Keith's 2 kids were still at her house, unaware that their father was dead. And since Linda and her new husband Steve were potential suspects, Short wanted to be the one to break the news to them, to see how they all reacted. So he looked up Linda's address in the database, and then grabbed his keys and headed out. Less than an hour later, Short parked his car in Linda's driveway and walked up to the front door. He knocked, and a woman opened the door, and Short asked her if she was Linda, and she said yes. And then he flashed his badge and said he'd like to come in. And Linda, she seemed a bit confused, but she opened the door and let him inside. Short walked into what seemed like a perfectly normal Sunday morning routine inside of the house. The air smelled like eggs and bacon, and the two kids were in the living room watching cartoons with a man who Short figured must be Linda's new husband, Steve. And so Short, he asked Steve to leave the kids and come into the kitchen with he and Linda, because he wanted to speak to both of them. And then once all three of them had sat down at the kitchen table, Short broke the news that Keith had been murdered. And then Short watched as Linda literally collapsed into Steve's arms. Short gave them a minute, but then he cut right to the chase, and he asked where Linda and Steve had been at about 3 a.m. that morning. Linda seemed shocked to realize that clearly the detective was considering both her and her husband as suspects, but she choked out that they'd both been at home with the kids sleeping. And Steve just nodded in agreement. He said they'd all been home together all night, that was it. Nothing about their demeanor or their reactions was suspicious to Short. But when he pressed Linda about what her relationship with her ex-husband was like, she admitted that it was contentious, and that actually just a couple of days earlier, she'd spoken to a lawyer about potentially changing their custody agreement. Short found the timing of this a little convenient, and he wondered, maybe Linda or Steve had decided they would just settle the custody battle by simply taking Keith out of the picture for good. And he also found it convenient that Linda and Keith's two kids weren't at Keith's house when the attack happened. It was only Anita's kids who were there at the time. But Short thanked the couple for their time and told them he would be in touch if he had any more questions. And then he left their house, and as he got into his car and drove back to the station, he kept going over the conversation he had just had in his mind. Linda and Steve's alibis were pretty weak. They seemed to be the only two people who could vouch for their whereabouts for the night of the murder, and so what that meant was Short had every reason to keep both of them at the very top of his suspect list. Late that night, Short was sitting at his desk in his office when his phone rang. He picked it up, and it was the police in Boise, Idaho. They'd managed to track down Anita's ex-husband, Luther. Short immediately sat up straight and grabbed a pencil to take notes. The officer on the line told him that when they'd gotten to Luther's house, he wasn't there. But his fiancée, Connie, was. And she told them that he'd been out on a weekend hunting trip. So the officers had gone out and searched for Luther in the area where he said he'd been hunting, but they didn't find him until that evening when Luther actually arrived back at his house. The officer said, at that point they took him in for questioning, and he had told them the same thing that Connie had, that he'd been out elk hunting about an hour away from Boise all weekend. Luther had been able to describe basically every step of his hunting trip in great detail, but since he had been hunting alone, there was nobody to corroborate his alibi. Now, Short knew that the drive from Boise to Largo, Florida, where the attack took place, took at least 3 or 4 days. So the fact that Luther was in Boise less than 24 hours after the murders meant that he could not have driven there. But there was still a possibility that if he was involved, maybe he could have flown. Now, Short knew it would be difficult, but not impossible, for Luther to catch a plane to Florida and back during the time that he was supposedly out hunting. So he told the Boise officer to look into whether Luther had recently purchased an airline ticket and to also take saliva, blood, and hair samples from Luther. After Short hung up the phone, he just sat back in his chair and thought for a second. It was less than 24 hours into this investigation, and Short already had 3 suspects in his crosshairs: Keith's ex-wife Linda, and Linda's new husband Steve, and also Anita's ex-husband Luther. And then also, to some degree, Luther's fiancée, Connie, could have been involved, but based on logistics and the fact that she was at the house, it seemed unlikely. But there was one big problem. Based on Anita and Jason's eyewitness testimony, the suspect they were looking for was a dark-skinned man who Anita had never met before, and that description would not apply to any of their suspects. Short knew that the suspect description might not be reliable. After all, it had been dark in the house, so Jason could have been wrong about the killer's skin color, and Anita was barely conscious during her interview, so her recollections might not be accurate at all. But if it was accurate, it could mean any number of things for Short's investigation. It could mean it was a random robbery after all, just some random person who went in the house and did this horrible thing. It could also mean that, one of his current suspects had maybe hired somebody to commit the crime, or it could mean that all Short's theories about the case were just completely wrong, and he had no idea what happened. Short rubbed his eyes and looked at the clock and realized it was almost midnight, so he decided it was time to go home and get some sleep. Maybe, he hoped, by morning, a new piece of evidence might turn up that would help point him in the right direction. Around 7 a.m. the next morning, so about 28 hours after Keith's murder, Short pulled into the parking lot of Pinecrest Golf Course, which was less than a mile away from Keith and Anita's house. And at this very moment, Short was feeling really optimistic about the case, because a groundskeeper at this golf course had called the police that morning and said they'd found a ski mask and a glove lying in the grass. So now, Short got out of his car and he went into the clubhouse, and the groundskeeper was there waiting for him. And he said he had left the ski mask and the glove right outside, right where he had found them. So Short followed the groundskeeper out onto the course, and as they walked, Short made note of all the ponds scattered around and also the lake at the park right across the street. He wondered if maybe the killer might have tossed their weapon or weapons into the water. A minute later, the groundskeeper stopped walking and pointed down at the ground, at a black ski mask and a dark-colored cotton glove lying in the grass, exactly as promised. And so Short put on a pair of latex gloves and he knelt down and he carefully lifted up the mask. And as he did, he felt that clearly it was crusted with something reddish-brown, very likely dried blood. As soon as Short got back to the station, he sent the mask and the glove off to the crime lab for testing, hoping that they might find a trace of the killer's DNA. Then Short spoke to his supervisor about sending a team of divers out to search the water at the golf course and also that park, in case the murder weapons had been disposed of in any of those water bodies. It seemed like a long shot that they would actually find something, but it was the best lead they had so far, and finding the weapon or weapons could really help them narrow down their suspect list. And by the time Short got back to his desk, he saw that his answering machine was blinking. There was a new message. And so he hit play, and the message was from a man who said he had information on the Keith Young case. So Short called him back right away. And when the man answered, he said he was a college student who lived a block away from Keith and Anita Young's house. And he said on the night of the murder, he and his friends had been hanging out in his driveway, and they'd seen a man jogging east down Coronet Avenue. And Short immediately turned and looked at the map on the wall, and he got really excited because he saw Coronet Avenue was actually the exact path the killer would have had to take to get from Keith and Anita's house to that golf course. Short asked the young man to describe this jogger, and the college student said that it appeared to be a white man with short dark hair. Short asked him if he was pretty sure about that, and the student said yeah. In fact, the jogger had passed under a streetlight at one point, so they all got a pretty good look. This was a huge development, since 12-year-old Jason, one of the eyewitnesses, had said the killer had dark skin. It was very possible now that maybe Jason was wrong. But it was also possible that there were now two men involved in the attack. Maybe one had dark skin and one had light skin. The following week, Short opened up a folder that had just been sent over from the police in Northport, Florida, a town 85 miles away. On December 19th, so just 4 days after Keith Young was murdered, a man and 3 kids in Northport, Florida were shot to death in the middle of the night inside of their home. The suspects in that attack were 2 men wearing ski masks, and they had cut the house's phone lines. So the similarities between these 2 killings were easy to see, but as far as Short could tell, the victims in the second attack didn't have any connections to the Youngs. Plus, the victims in the second attack had been shot instead of stabbed. And so as Short really did try to look for all the similarities he could between the 2 crime scenes, he just couldn't get over how sort of blatantly personal the very violent and bloody attack felt at the Youngs' house. So even though there was this other, on the surface, similar killing in Florida, and even though Jason and Anita both swore they did not recognize the intruder, Short was not ready to rule out that Keith Young had been killed by someone who knew him. His strongest suspect was still Anita's ex-husband, Luther, who claimed to have been out hunting alone at the time of the attack. As for Anita, her condition had actually finally stabilized, and when Short had gone to speak to her at the hospital, she had said that Luther was really the only person she could think of who might want to hurt her, because they'd been arguing a lot about custody and also child support. But the Boise police had checked with every airline in the country, and none of them had a record of Luther flying into Florida that weekend. So Short couldn't even prove that Luther was in the state at the time of the attack. And then also, Anita had mentioned that she'd been having problems with Keith's ex-wife, Linda. She said that Linda had been harassing her all summer long, calling her so many times that she couldn't even use her own phone. Short definitely still had his eye on Linda, but he still hadn't found anything directly linking Linda or her new husband Steve to the crime. But Short was still very hopeful that this case would get solved, because a preliminary report from the forensics lab had just come in that said a Caucasian hair had been discovered inside the black ski mask that was found on the golf course, which could point to any one of Short's main suspects. And Short knew it was only a matter of time before the forensics lab finished its full analysis of that hair sample, and then they would know for sure if it was an exact match. One day in early January of 1992, so a few weeks after Keith's murder, Detective Short got into the office and checked his answering machine, and he found that he'd gotten a message from the forensics lab telling him to call back right away. And so right away he picked up the phone and dialed the number, and he could feel his heart pounding as the line rang. This could finally be the break in the case he'd been waiting for. And when the technician picked up, he told Short that, they had analyzed that hair in the mask and they'd analyzed the DNA. But it was not a match for Short's top suspect, Anita's ex-husband, Luther. Not a match. Short thanked the technician and hung up, feeling very disappointed. Now, this still didn't fully rule Luther out, especially because Short still thought there might have been maybe 2 suspects involved. But he decided that at this point, it was time for investigators to really focus on other possibilities. Several weeks later, so in early 1992, roughly a couple of months after Keith Young's murder, Detective Short knocked on the front door of Linda's house. Linda is Keith's ex-wife. And when Linda opened the door and saw the detective once again standing outside her house, she quickly let him inside. The house was quiet, and Linda told Short that she was the only one home. They sat down in the living room, and then they ran through all the subjects that Short had grilled her on the first time around. Her alibi, her custody disputes, her tense relationship with Keith, and none of her answers changed. And she really didn't say anything that could be viewed as incriminating. But as their conversation began to wrap up, Linda looked anxious, like there was something more she wanted to say. Short asked her what was going on, and she said that there was something she hadn't mentioned when they had spoken the first time. It was about her new husband, Steve. She said that a while back, after she and Steve had gotten married, that briefly she had rekindled her relationship with Keith. Steve had found out that she was cheating on him, and he was naturally very upset. Linda said that a few months ago, Steve had even made a few jokes about hurting Keith. At the time, she didn't think he was serious, but after Keith was killed, she started worrying that Steve might have somehow been involved. She said that she had even gone so far as to check Steve's knife collection to make sure none of them were missing. Short was careful not to let his shock come across his face, but inside, his mind was absolutely spinning. He'd always thought it was possible that Linda and Steve were both in on the murder, but now it sounded like maybe Steve might have acted alone. He also wondered, though, if Linda was ratting out her husband to draw suspicion away from herself. So, to help get to the bottom of it, he asked Linda to come with him back to the station for a polygraph test. He also planned to order another polygraph for Steve, who was suddenly at the very top of his suspect list. But almost 2 months later, in March of 1992, Short was back in his office staring down at a pile of documents he'd already read over 1,000,000 times, and the evidence still didn't point him toward anybody in particular. Linda and Steve had both taken their polygraph tests, but the results did not indicate they were guilty, and there was still no hard evidence that tied either of them to the crime. Also, after searching all the ponds and that lake in the area, police still had not found a murder weapon, and they'd still not been able to match that strand of hair from the presumed killer's ski mask to any of the suspects on their radar. Short still had really 3 main suspects who could have been responsible for the murder. There was Keith's ex-wife Linda, who had been fighting with him about custody. Her alibi was weak and only supported by her new husband Steve, who she had been suspicious of when Short interviewed her for a second time. And so Steve was also one of his primary suspects because he had this, terrible history with Keith and had even openly joked about, hurting Keith. And then there was Luther, Anita's hot-headed ex-husband, who lived on the other side of the country. Now, it would have been possible for him to fly from Idaho to Florida and commit this crime, but there was no proof that he did. And of course, there was still the possibility that this was just a random attack or a robbery gone wrong. And investigators still couldn't even be sure if they were looking for one or two or more suspects. They had no idea. So Short had plenty of theories, but still no evidence to back any of them up. The investigation had gone so cold that the task force assigned to the case had been reduced from 5 detectives to just 2. Short was starting to fear that Keith's murder might never be solved. But just then, Short's phone rang. And when he picked up the receiver, a voice said that they knew something about that previous break-in attempt at Keith and Anita's house a few months before Keith's murder. And as Detective Short listened to what this caller had to say, he suddenly knew exactly who had broken into that house and killed Keith and tried to kill Anita. Based on all the collected evidence, as well as the killer's eventual partial confession, this is what investigators believe happened to Keith and Anita Young on the morning of December 15th, 1991. At 3 a.m., the killer saw that all the windows in Keith and Anita's house were dark. So they carefully snuck around the side of the home and cut the phone lines, just like they'd done a few months before. The first time, they'd second-guessed themselves and didn't go through with what they had planned. But this time was going to be different. The killer broke into the house very easily, feeling very calm and in control. They had an axe in their right hand and a knife in their left. As they made their way through the living room, they heard growling and hissing, and they looked down to see the family's cat standing in their path. They thought about strangling the cat to shut it up, but decided not to. They wanted to do this with as little collateral damage as possible. So they bent down and tried to soothe the cat, and when it worked and the cat became quiet, the killer stepped past the cat and began walking down the hall. They made it to the master bedroom, they opened up the door and stepped inside. Anita and Keith were fast asleep in their beds, and so the killer quietly walked over to the side of the bed that Anita was on, and they stood there looking down at her, getting ready to do what they felt like they had to do. But as the killer was looking down at Anita stirred awake, and for a brief second, she looked up and locked eyes with the killer. And the killer instinctively just swung the axe down, hitting Anita squarely in the head. But she fought back and she shouted out Keith's name to wake him up. And the next thing the killer knew, Keith was on top of them, pulling them away from Anita. And so the killer began hitting Keith with the axe as well, but even despite being hit about 3 times, Keith would not let up. And so they struggled and shoved each other, and their fight kind of spilled out of the bedroom into the main portion of the house. This was not how the killer had hoped this would go. They'd wanted to get this done quickly and leave without anybody waking up, but they'd clearly underestimated Keith. No matter how many times the killer stabbed him or hacked at him with the axe, he didn't stop fighting. And then as the killer and Keith continued sort of fumbling around and making their way back down the hallway, the killer suddenly felt something hard smash into the back of their skull, and they turned to see Anita standing there behind them with blood running down her face and a baseball bat in her hands. The killer heard Keith shout out for Anita to go get the gun, and he saw Anita run toward a nearby closet. The killer also noticed a young boy looking out from a doorway nearby, and so the killer made a split-second decision. They just grabbed Keith and chucked him into the master bedroom, and then the killer sprinted back down the hallway and out the front door. And then when they got to the sidewalk, they removed their ski mask and kind of casually jogged down the street, hoping that to anybody looking outside, they would think the killer was just, an unassuming health nut out for a very early morning run. When they got to a nearby golf course, they stopped on the grass to change their clothes. And then after that, they stole a bike and rode away. Things had not gone the way the killer had hoped. But as they reflected on what they had just done, they thought to themselves that in reality, this actually could have gone worse. They didn't kill the cat, and critically, no kids have been hurt either. And in some ways, that's what this was all about, to avoid hurting the kids. Because the killer was Anita's ex-husband, Luther Bass. He'd wanted to get Anita out of the way so he could have custody of their 4 kids and treat them the way he believed they needed to be treated. and he'd wanted to get Anita out of the way so that he could have custody of his 4 kids. He felt like she was screwing up their lives, that he was the kids' solution. They needed him, and so he had to do this. But Luther's own fiancée, Connie, had ultimately told the Boise police that Luther was the one who had cut Keith and Anita's phone lines a few months back before the murder. And she said she knew Luther had actually flown to Florida on the weekend of the murder, using an alias and fake social security number that he had gotten from his coworker. And once the Boise police finished speaking with Connie, they immediately called Detective Short in Florida to tell him what they'd just learned. It turned out there was no second suspect. It was just Luther. So 12-year-old Jason had just been wrong about the killer's appearance, and Anita had been wrong about not knowing who they were. As for that hair that had been found inside the black ski mask that Luther had been wearing, it's unclear how that was there. It wasn't Luther's hair, but it's possible that maybe somebody else had put the mask on at some point, and that's how it got there. Luther Bass was arrested in Boise, Idaho on March 6, 1992, and he confessed to the crime on the same day. A year later, he was convicted of first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, and burglary with an assault. He was sentenced to life plus 30 years in prison. As for Anita, she would recover from her injuries. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Kate Gallagher. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or. On the morning of February 28, 2005, a 64-year-old man named Michael Lefkow limped down the stairs inside of his home in Chicago, Illinois. He'd injured his Achilles tendon playing tennis the week before, so now he had a cast on his leg, and he had to get around on crutches. When Michael got into the kitchen, he saw his wife Joan making breakfast for the whole household, which included Michael, their teenage daughter Meg, and Joan's elderly mother, Donna, who had been living with them for the past 4 or 5 months. Michael said good morning to his wife, and then he hobbled his way through the kitchen over to the dining room where Meg was finishing up her eggs. And they chatted for a few minutes, and then the school bus honked outside, and Meg grabbed her backpack and raced past her dad on her way out the front door. A few moments later, Joan walked into the dining room as well with a plate of food for Michael and a cup of orange juice. And Michael thanked her, and then he asked her, "What's on the docket for you today?" And he meant that literally, because Joan was a federal judge. And, she had like a very heavy burden on her shoulders. She was routinely thrust into these cases where it was her job to make these just really difficult decisions. Decisions that, sometimes were sort of in that gray area between, is this the right moral decision or is this the right legal decision? And it was really her job to err on the side of legal. And the reality is she was a great judge, but sometimes her decisions would, put her in danger. This was, again, a very heavy burden, and it was something that Michael, being an attorney himself, definitely understood. He knew what it meant to be a judge. But, on this particular day, when Michael asked her what she was up to in court, it just sounded an awful lot like today was going to be very typical, sort of a run-of-the-mill day for her. Nothing too crazy, no big decisions looming. And so pretty soon, the two of them were just having their breakfast, and it was just a very relaxed morning. And at some point, Michael told Joan that because of his injury, he actually was not going into the office today. He was going to be working from home. And so pretty soon, they wrapped up their breakfast, they cleaned up, and then before long, Joan was ready to go. She grabbed her stuff, and she said goodbye to her husband, and then out the door she went, hopped in her car, and drove off to court. About half an hour later, around 9 a.m., Michael was getting ready to start his day at the house when he saw Joan's mother, Donna, coming down the stairs. Donna was 89 years old and needed 2 canes just to walk, and she'd been hospitalized for sepsis the previous year. So, since Joan and Michael had extra space in their home, they had offered to let her stay with them so she wouldn't be alone and they could help her if they needed to. And so Michael, despite being hurt himself, he immediately got up and hobbled over and helped Donna get down the last few steps, and then he led her back over to the dining room and helped her sit in her favorite chair. And then after she was situated and she said that she didn't need anything else, Michael thought, okay, now I'm going to start my day. And so he gathered up his things and he headed downstairs into the basement where his home office was. When Michael reached the bottom of the basement steps, he hobbled his way down this hallway that led to a door. He opened the door up and inside was his home office. In he went and he sat down at his desk, and there was already some files on the desk that he needed to sift through, and so he picked them up and began looking through the files, figuring out where he was going to start for the day. And as he was sitting there, he thought he heard something in the closet, the utility closet that was in the home office that he was in, and the door to the utility closet was shut. And he just sat there and he listened, and again, he heard what sounded like rustling or something inside of this closet. And so he thought, maybe it's the furnace that's, working extra hard right now. Maybe it's making some weird sounds or something, but, for whatever reason, he's thinking there's something happening in this closet. I want to see what it is. And so he gets up and he hobbles his way over to the closet. And then right as he's hearing more rustling inside, he turns the doorknob and he opens up this closet. At 5 p.m. that night, Michael's wife, Joan, walked through the parking garage at the federal courthouse and got into her car. She was feeling a bit unsettled because she had called Michael a couple of times that afternoon, but there had been no answer. And this was just really unlike him. In fact, this was so unusual that Joan had actually gotten in touch with her daughter, Meg, after the school day ended and asked her, have you been in touch with Dad? And Meg said that she hadn't. But she had gone home after school and she had grabbed some workout clothes in the house before leaving again. And she said when she was in the house, she had not seen her dad or, Joan's mom, so her grandmother, Donna. She said the house was quiet and I just assumed that Dad and Grandma were asleep upstairs or something. It took Joan about half an hour to drive home, and when she pulled into the driveway around 5:30 that night, it was getting dark. And so she pulls into her driveway, she gets out, she's still pretty anxious because she just hasn't heard from Michael or her mom at this point, and she goes up to the front door, she unlocks it, she steps inside, and right away she calls out for Michael. But there's no answer. She calls out for her mom. There's no answer. And so she walks around the first floor. Again, no sign of any issues here. Her husband and her mom are not around. She eventually makes her way upstairs, hoping to find them asleep in their beds, but she gets up there and she checks the bedrooms and all the rooms upstairs, and there's no one up there. And so the only place left to look in the house was the basement. But at this hour, it just made no sense that Michael or her mom would be in the basement. And so eventually, even though she felt really uneasy, she went back to the first floor. She went to the doorway that led down to the stairs into the basement, and she took a deep breath. She turned on the lights inside of the stairwell down to the basement, and she called out for Michael and her mom, but still no answer. And then down the stairs she went. And when she got to the base of the stairs, she looked down that hallway that led to Michael's office. And she saw, first, there was nothing. She didn't see anything. But on the floor, right outside of Michael's office, she saw what looked like blood on the ground. And so at this point, she panicked. She ran down the hallway. She's screaming for Michael. She grabs the door handle. She opens it up. And it's like everything she saw in there was so shocking. It was like her brain couldn't process it. And she just shut the door right away. Like she couldn't handle what she had just seen. And then a moment later, she had bolted back upstairs and called 911. In the late evening of February 28, 2005, Special Agent Douglas Seacombe of the Chicago FBI office ducked under the crime scene tape around the Lefkow family's home. So about 30 minutes earlier, the 911 call had come out of this home from Joan about what appeared to be a murder at this address. And since the caller, Joan, had identified herself as a federal judge, the Chicago police had immediately called the FBI to take part in this investigation. And so now, Special Agent Seacombe flashed his badge to one of the uniformed officers who was standing outside right near the edge of the crime scene tape. And he asked them, "Where is Judge Joan Lefkow?" And the officer said that Judge Joan, along with her daughters, so not just Meg, her teenage daughter, but also Joan's 3 adult daughters who no longer lived at home, they had all been taken together to a safe house by the U.S. Marshals. And so Seacombe, after hearing this, stepped inside the house, and he found a whole bunch of forensic teams already hard at work sweeping every room for evidence. And as he walked through the living room and the kitchen on the main floor, he didn't see any signs of blood or a struggle of any kind, and he also saw that, TV and other expensive-looking electronics were still in place, and so he didn't think this was a robbery gone wrong. Seacom eventually found his way to the stairs that led down into the basement, and so down he went, and he found there were a few officers and a crime scene photographer that were down there gathered around a door that was at the end of the hallway. And so Seacom made his way down the hallway, he pushed past the group of people, and there, inside of this home office, he saw 2 dead bodies. There was a man who was lying face down, and then right next to him was also an elderly woman who was lying face up, and there was just a big pool of blood underneath both of them. Seacom immediately noticed that both the victims had fairly obvious gunshot wounds to their heads. And then when he knelt down to get a better look, he also found shell casings scattered around on the floor. So he figured that very likely these 2 clearly have been shot, but more specifically, they've been shot and killed in this room. On the other side of this office, Seacom saw there was a closet and its doors were open, and it appeared to be a utility closet. And so Seacom, he walked over and he stepped inside, and inside of it was this big furnace, and then next to it on the ground, he found there was a 12-pack of beer bottles, except one of the bottles was missing. And so Seacom looked around inside the closet, he didn't see the 12th bottle, and then he turned around and looked back into the office. And as he's looking back into the office, he notices there's this window high up inside of the office, and it actually was out to the ground floor, because this is a basement, right? This is a window that leads to the first floor of the house, if you will. And there's like a cutout inside of the office, like a windowsill, almost like a ledge that is part of this window, right? So you could actually place things on this windowsill if you wanted to. And he looked up into this window and he saw there was a single beer bottle sitting on that windowsill, on that ledge. And also he saw the window itself was shattered. And so right away, Seacom's thinking like, okay, did the killer leave behind this beer? And if so, why? Like, is this a message? Are they leaving the bottle here on purpose for us to find it? Or is this a mistake? And so Seacom, he called for a forensics officer to come over and bag this additional bottle, the 12th bottle, and swab it for DNA and fingerprints in case, this was left by the killer. And so the forensics officer, he placed this bottle inside of a plastic bag, and then he asked Seacom to leave the office and head upstairs for a minute so that he and his team could spray the entire basement with a chemical called leucocrystal violet, which can illuminate traces of blood that are not necessarily visible to the naked eye. And so as Seacom left the office and began making his way upstairs, he began thinking about what he had just learned. So you have a broken window leading into the home office where it appears the shooting took place. And the fact that, the window was broken does suggest that's how the killer or killers got in. And if that's the case, it likely means the killer or killers did not know the victims personally. They didn't have a key to the house, for example, or they weren't going to be let in if they showed up at the front door. But then you have this weird beer bottle thing. Like if the killer left behind beer in that utility closet and this extra beer bottle up on the ledge of the window, that feels really sloppy. And so that's sort of at odds with the idea that this was like an intentional, outsider coming to do this hit. And then he's also thinking like, the elephant in the room here is that Joan, Judge Joan Lefkow, this is her husband and her mother. Was that intentional? Were they trying to sort of indirectly hurt Judge Joan? Or was Judge Joan the target? Or was this coincidence? An hour later, while forensics teams were still searching the crime scene, Seacom went out to canvass the neighborhood. The chemical spray that the forensics team had sprayed in the basement after Seacom had left had in fact revealed additional traces of blood all over the basement hallway. So it looked like at least one of the victims had actually been shot in the hallway and then moved into the office. And then the killer apparently had cleaned the hallway afterwards, but obviously this chemical had still revealed the blood traces. And so Seacom thought to himself that if the killer or killers stuck around to clean up after themselves, it suggests that they went into this home with the intention of committing murder. It was just a matter of why. Was it Joan the target? Was it her loved ones? Why did that happen? Who would want to harm the Lefkows? And so Seacom went down the street knocking on doors and speaking to various neighbors, trying to get a feel for, what the Lefkows were like. But, after speaking to many people on the block who tried to be very helpful, Seacom really hadn't learned much of anything. Like, no one really had all that much to say. But eventually, Seacom found his way to a church that was in the neighborhood, and he knocked on the door. And a moment later, the pastor opened the door, and Seacom explained that, unfortunately, a double murder had taken place down the block, and they were here investigating. And have you seen or heard anything unusual in the past, several hours? And the pastor at first is just totally taken aback by what he's been told. He can't believe it. But then he's like, you know what? Actually, yeah, something strange did happen earlier today. The pastor said he had seen this red car just loitering nearby that had two men inside of it, and they were apparently smoking and drinking cans of what appeared to be Coca-Cola. But they just sort of didn't fit in with the neighborhood. Like, the pastor didn't know who they were, and it just seems sort of odd that they were here. And so, just considering what he's been told about this double murder, he basically said, you might want to look into who those guys were. And so Seacom asked the pastor if he'd gotten a good enough look at these two men to maybe be able to help their sketch artist come up with a composite sketch. And the pastor said, yeah, I think so. And so Seacom's like, okay, great, we're going to do that. But also, can you specifically point out where this car was, like outside, so I can go look at the area? And the pastor, he pointed across the street and he said, right over there. And so Seacom, he looks where the pastor is pointing, and sure enough, he could see on the ground there were all these cigarette butts and clearly an empty Coke can. And so Seacom called over a forensics team, and they scooped the stuff up and they sent it off to be tested. Later that same night, Seacom sat down at a table at the safe house where Joan and her daughters were all staying. And Joan, she walked over and set a glass of water in front of him, and then she sat down across from him. And Seacom thought Joan seemed surprisingly calm and composed, considering her husband and her mother have just been brutally murdered. But he also could sense that underneath the surface of Joan's sort of calm affect, she seemed furious. And so Seacom and Joan, they spoke a little bit about, this great tragedy and how awful this was. However, pretty quickly, Seacom just sort of got into asking pointed questions of Joan, and Joan answered them. Seacom asked Joan about the 12-pack of beer that was in the utility closet in the basement, and she told him it was left over from a party that they had thrown earlier that same week. And she said she was the one who actually put those beers in the closet, and when she did, she said they were all unopened. And this was great news for Seacom and the investigation, because that meant that the beer up on that windowsill in the basement almost certainly was handled by the killer or killers. But still, the idea of somebody breaking into this house and stumbling across some beer in the closet and stopping to actually have a drink right in the middle of committing a double murder and then leaving the beer bottle behind, it just felt like a really weird decision to make. And so Seacom wondered if maybe there was something at play here that literally prevented the killer from thinking clearly in the moment, like mental illness or maybe drug use. So at this point, Seacom had already come to the conclusion that very likely Donna, Joan's elderly mother, was not the intended target. She's 89, she doesn't have any known enemies, she's not hurting anyone, like she's not a target here. But perhaps Michael, Joan's husband, could have been the target. After all, at one point he had actually run for Cook County judge a few years ago, and even though he had lost, entering politics was a surefire way to make enemies, so it was possible he could have been the target and Donna was collateral damage, but most likely of all still was that Joan was the one being targeted. Seacom knew that as a federal judge, there could be literally hundreds of people holding very serious grudges against her. And so Seacom told Joan that back at the command post, there was a team of detectives going through her entire docket and making a list of everyone who might have had a ruling that they were not happy with in the past few years. But maybe to help speed things along, he asked Joan if she could think of anybody off the top of her head who might have been responsible for this. And Joan, sort of without hesitation, said, yeah. In fact, there were 3 cases that came to mind. The first case was about a guy named Sean Peters, who was the leader of a local gang. And Joan had given him a very lengthy prison sentence, and so she said any of his fellow gang members, in theory, could have come after her in retaliation. The second case she brought up was about this armed robber whose name was Richard Young, and she said he just really scared her in the courtroom. Like, he himself was just a very intimidating and sort of threatening person, and so he seemed capable of doing something like this. And she said the third case was about Matthew Hale. And before she even got into the explanation, Seacom recognized the name. Because at the time, Hale was one of the most notorious white supremacists in all of Illinois. 6 years earlier, one of his followers had committed this horrible shooting spree that left 2 people dead and 9 others injured. Joan said that Hale had actually targeted her a couple of years ago in the wake of this trademark dispute. A church in Oregon with the same name as Hale's group had sued them, and Joan had actually enforced a ruling that forced Hale to change his group's name. Joan said that just the year before, Hale had actually been convicted of plotting to kill her over this issue. Joan said he was still in prison for those charges, so Seacom realized he could not have pulled the trigger himself, but clearly he had many followers who were willing to do things like this for him. The next day, so March 1st, Seacom sat down from notorious white supremacist Matthew Hale in a visiting room at the prison in Chicago where he was incarcerated. Hale was this very clean-cut, very stern-looking man in his mid-30s, and he didn't seem remotely rattled to be sitting across from an FBI agent who basically was insinuating that Hale was a potential suspect in a double homicide. And so Seacom told Hale about how Joan Lefkow's husband and her elderly mother had been brutally murdered inside of her home. And in response, Hale just laughed. He said that he and his followers had nothing to do with those murders. But, this was more or less what Seacom had expected Hale to say, because Hale was actually still awaiting sentencing for having tried to kill Joan. So of course he's not going to admit here to arranging another murder. He's going to say, no, I had nothing to do with it. Seacom told him that it really didn't matter if he denied this, because at this very moment, agents were seizing his phone and computer records, and if he had said anything at all about Joan Lefkow and her family to any of his followers, they would find out. But Hale, he just sat back and smiled and continued to insist that he's like, look, I really had nothing to do with this one. Like, nothing at all. You will find nothing. And Seacom couldn't help but think that Hale seemed so calm and so confident that really deep down he thought to himself, maybe he's telling the truth. Later that same afternoon, Seacom hunched over a desk in the corner of the Chicago Police Command Post. At this point, the police, the FBI, and the U.S. Marshals were all working on this case as part of a joint task force. And all the officers on the task force had moved their equipment into the police precinct so the investigation could be centralized. In a conference room to his left, Seacom could see police officers comparing photos of Matthew Hale's followers to the composite sketches of the 2 men in the red car who the pastor had seen near the crime scene. And at a desk to Seacom's right, there was another FBI agent who was listening to a recording of a phone call that Hale had recently made to his mother. The FBI at this point was taping all of Hale's phone calls in case he said anything incriminating. And meanwhile, other task force officers were sorting through this huge pile of letters that Hale had received in prison. However, after going through these letters, there was no mention of the Lefkows anywhere. However, at some point, Seacom would join these other officers and continue to sort through all this mail in case something got missed. And as he was sorting through, months worth of mail, something actually did catch his attention. For months, Hale had been exchanging letters with this woman whose name was Kathleen Robertazzo. Basically every other day they were speaking. And Hale did not write to anybody else nearly that often, not even his own family. So this woman was clearly very important. Now, on the surface, nothing in these letters between Hale and Kathleen was incriminating. However, given the frequency of communication, Seacom had to wonder if maybe these two could be talking in code. Like maybe they are talking about the Lefkows, but we just can't tell. The return address on these letters was for a suburb in Chicago, about 30 miles away from the prison where Hale was at. So Seacom bundled up all the letters from Kathleen and stuck them inside of an envelope. He would need them as evidence to get a search warrant. The next evening, March 2nd, 2005, Special Agent Douglas Seacom led a team of FBI agents up the driveway of a suburban home just outside of Chicago. And as they made their way up the driveway, they saw the car, parked there, was red, just like the car the pastor had seen outside the church that had been loitering near where Michael and Donna had been killed. Seacom made his way up to the front door and he knocked. And then a moment later, a woman answered and he said, "Are you Kathleen Robertazzo?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, okay. And he held up a search warrant and he said, we're here to search your house. And so Seacom stayed outside with Kathleen while the other agents went inside and swept the whole house. And Kathleen seemed really annoyed by this whole thing, but definitely not that surprised. And so while the team was searching the home, Seacom turned to Kathleen and asked her about her relationship with Matthew Hale. And he also asked her if she agreed with his, white supremacist views. And Kathleen admitted that, she did have a relationship with Matthew, but she corrected Seacom and said, I'm not a white supremacist. I'm a white separatist. Seacom sighed and moved on to asking Kathleen about her whereabouts on the day of Michael and Donna's murders. And Kathleen insisted that she had nothing to do with that. She gave Seacom her alibi for the whole day of February 28th, and while Seacom was writing down the details on his notepad, the other agents came back out of the house carrying a computer. When Kathleen began complaining that she needed that computer for her work, Seacom told her that they'd return it as soon as they searched it. And then before Seacom put his notepad away, he looked down to the driveway and he looked at Kathleen's red car. And he remembered that he actually hadn't written down the license plate or the make or the model. But as he's looking at this car, he's realizing that there's no way this car matched the description of the pastor's red car that he had seen loitering outside of the church. Like, this was definitely not the same car that was suspected of being involved in the murder. 2 days later, on the evening of Friday, March 4th, so now 4 days after Michael and Donna were killed, Special Agent Seacom carried a cup of coffee into a meeting room with the other officers on the task force, and he looked around the room and everybody just looked completely exhausted. It would turn out Kathleen's alibi had checked out, and her red car was definitely not the red car that had been spotted by the pastor, and there had been nothing on her computer that they had taken to search. So basically, she was cleared. And so Seacom and his fellow FBI agents, over the past couple of days, this is right after Kathleen was cleared, they had gone ahead and expanded their search and began interviewing more and more of Matthew Hale's followers. And a lot of them were very confrontational, and at least 3 people were detained for starting fights with the investigators. But one by one, their alibis began to check out, and so none of them were tied to Michael and Donna's murders, at least not yet. Now, a lot of Hale's followers had criminal records, so Seacom was hoping that maybe once fingerprint evidence came back from the crime lab, it would turn up a match. But deep down, realistically, Seacom was starting to doubt that anybody in Hale's circle was behind this. Additionally, the task force had investigated that gang leader Joan had mentioned, Sean Peters, as well as that armed robber, Richard Young, and they both also had been cleared as suspects. And so now, Seacom couldn't help but feel like, we're 4 days into this investigation, this pretty high-profile investigation, and it sort of seems like we really don't have much to show for it. Now, it was the case that there were still dozens of other people on Joan's court docket that maybe could have wanted to kill her that Joan was not aware of, but it was going to take time to keep sorting through all these people, and right now they didn't have traction in any one direction. It was like everything was sort of becoming a dead end. And so as Seacom is sitting in this room full of the other agents, and they're all sort of at a loss for what to do next, he was thinking to himself, is it possible that we've all just sort of wrongfully jumped to conclusions? We all basically assumed that this attack was, targeted at Joan. But Seacom's thinking to himself, he couldn't remember any other case where a judge's family was killed and not the judge themselves. Just then, Seacom's supervisor from the Chicago FBI office kicked off the meeting by announcing that the agency was putting up a $50,000 reward to the public for information on the murders. Now, the task force by this point had received over 200 tips, but the supervisor said, clearly that wasn't enough, and so we're going to use this reward to try to entice people who might have been too afraid to come forward. We'll pay them, and so hopefully this leads to better tips. The next Tuesday, so 9 days after Michael and Donna's murders, Seacom walked into the command post. The task force had been working all weekend, following up on hundreds and hundreds of calls that had come in since the reward money was announced. But it still didn't really seem like they were getting anywhere. And so Seacom, he sat down at his desk and he opened up a folder and he was about to get started when his cell phone rang. And he answered it, and it was the deputy director of the crime lab. And so Seacom's heart began to pound with anticipation as the deputy director told him that they had analyzed those fingerprints found on that beer bottle in the basement of the crime scene up in the window ledge, and after they had run it through the database, they had found a match. based on forensic evidence and a confession from the killer. This is what police believe happened to Michael Lefkow and Donna Humphrey on February 28, 2005. Around 4:30 a.m., while everybody in the Lefkow house was still asleep, the killer smashed through that basement window and climbed down into the basement, and with them was a gun. Their plan was to hide in the utility closet all day, and then once everybody inside the house cleared out, they would leave the utility closet, sneak upstairs, and they would wait. And when the time was right, they would jump out, and they would ambush the person that they wanted to seek revenge on. But things did not go according to plan. Around 9 a.m., the killer was still in the closet when they heard footsteps coming downstairs, coming down the hallway and into the office where they were, and then they heard the sound of somebody sitting in that desk chair and papers shuffling around. And then a moment later, they heard the sound of footsteps as somebody approached the closet. And then before long, the closet doors opened and there was this man standing there looking really surprised. He was on crutches and he's looking at the killer. And the killer just panicked and they raised their gun and they shot this man point blank in the head. And he crumpled to the ground and the killer's looking down and there's just blood going everywhere. And they're like, I can't believe what I've done. And then a moment later, the killer hears somebody calling out, Michael, is that you? And he looks down the hallway and he sees this elderly woman shuffling down the hallway looking really concerned, who clearly just heard the gunshot, and sort of in a continued state of panic, the killer rushed out of the closet, went down the hallway, raised the gun, and shot this woman in the head as well. And as Donna is bleeding all over the hallway, the killer put their gun away, reached down, scooped her up, and dragged her over into the office and sort of dropped her next to Michael. At this point, the killer's looking down at what they've done and they're thinking, well, at this point, I better make sure they really are dead. So they pull out their gun again and they shoot Donna and Michael one more time, just to make sure they would not talk to anyone about what they had seen. After that, the killer went back into the utility closet and their eyes landed on that pack of beer sitting on the floor. And they felt like that was exactly what they needed right now to calm their nerves. So they reached down and they pulled out one of those beers and they cracked it open and they took a sip while they thought about what their next move was going to be. And so as the killer is drinking this beer, they're thinking to themselves, well, I've just killed two people that I did not intend to kill. Those were not my targets. And so they felt kind of bad, like two basically innocent people had been murdered here. And so it made the killer think, like, should I still stick around and wait for my intended target? And eventually they decided, you know what, I need to change my plan. And so the killer, they set their beer bottle down on the windowsill. Then they went and found a sponge and some bleach, and they began to try to clean up all the blood in the hallway. But as they're doing this, they're realizing there's just so much blood out here. There's bodies and lots more blood in the office. Like, this is too much. Like, I can't possibly clean all this. And so finally, around 1:15 p.m., the killer just sort of was like, well, this is as good as I can do in terms of cleanup. I'm just going to leave. And so they did. They left the house and they left behind that bottle in the windowsill that would have their DNA and fingerprints all over it. The killer was a man named Bart Ross, and his intended target was Joan Lefkow. But Bart was not like a hardened criminal. Bart was a cancer patient who had tried to sue his doctors after he lost part of his jaw during treatment. Ross had developed a vendetta against these doctors who had left him disfigured. And over the last few years, he'd become increasingly paranoid and detached from reality, and he ultimately blamed Joan Lefkow for dismissing his medical malpractice suit and preventing him from getting justice. And so Bart had put together this list of 25 doctors, lawyers, and judges he wanted to kill, and Joan just happened to be at the top of the list. But after going into her home with the intent to kill Joan, but actually just killing Michael and Donna, Ross was so shaken up by it that he gave up on attacking Joan and just left the scene. But he obviously left behind crucial clues that got him caught. Ross's fingerprints and DNA were found inside of Joan's home, not just on that beer bottle, but elsewhere in the house. However, his fingerprints and DNA were not found on those cigarette butts in the Coke can that was left on the curb where that suspicious red car had been parked. And also, Ross looked nothing like the composite sketches of those two men that were seen inside of that red car, so in the end, the investigators believed that the red car probably had nothing to do with the murders, and Ross simply acted alone. On March 9th, one day after the fingerprint results came back, Wisconsin police officers spotted Ross's van near a federal courthouse in Milwaukee. But as they approached his van, Ross fatally shot himself. However, inside of his van, police found a note confessing in detail to the murders of Michael Lefkow and Donna Humphrey. Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. This episode was written by Kate Gallagher. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus. In today's episode, I'm going to tell you 2 stories. In the first story, it's ultimately about this person who is so set on making a change in their lives that they take drastic measures to effect that change, with some very unfortunate consequences. The second story is about this town in California where there was this perceived threat, and it was sort of normalized and people were not that worried about it until it totally spiraled out of control. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Follow Button's house and write on their bathroom mirror, "I'm watching you" in red lipstick. Early in the morning on February 5th, 1990, 57-year-old Laverne Pavlinok stood in the kitchen of her Wilsonville, Oregon apartment making some coffee. Mornings were the best part of Laverne's day because she had the whole apartment to herself. Now, she lived with her boyfriend, John Sosnovsky, but he worked at a nearby mill and had to be out early in order to catch the bus there. And each time he left, Laverne felt like a huge weight lifted off of her. Because when John wasn't home, Laverne could go about her day and pretend she was safe. But that's all it was pretend. John, in reality, was an incredibly violent man. I mean, he was seriously physically abusive, especially when he was drunk, which was basically all the time. So Laverne had actually been married, but her husband had died of cancer, and she had ultimately met John following her husband's death. And so when they met, Laverne was very vulnerable and lonely, and she really hadn't realized the kind of person John was until it was too late. It had been 10 years now, and Laverne still had not, built up the courage to leave him. I mean, the reality was she was just scared of how he would react, and so she sort of felt trapped. Now, she sat down at her kitchen table with her coffee, and she opened up the local paper. And as soon as she did, the first thing she saw was a big black and white photo of a smiling young woman who likely was in her 20s. The photo was connected to an article about a recent murder that happened 30 miles away, just northeast of Portland. The victim had been identified as a woman named Tanya Bennett, and Tanya Bennett was the girl in the photo. The article said she had been beaten and then also strangled with a rope, and then she had been left on the side of the highway. And when Laverne read about the area she actually had been, dumped, she realized it actually was only about 1.5 miles down from this famous scenic overlook that Laverne had actually been to before. Like, she was familiar with this area. And so Laverne, she's reading the article and she's looking at this picture back and forth, and it was like something was sort of forming in her mind. She just had like this weird sense that she knew something about this case. And then, as she stared at this photo for a little bit longer, it's like it all came together. And she realized almost certainly that she knew John very likely killed this woman. And so even though she loved her peaceful, quiet mornings with her coffee, Laverne immediately stood up, she grabbed the phone, and she called the police. After she hung up with police, Laverne was very shaken up. I mean, her heart was still racing. I mean, this was a very risky thing she was doing, because she had no way of knowing if what she had just given authorities was enough to arrest John. if it wasn't, it was entirely possible that John would discover this betrayal of her calling the police about him, implicating him in a murder, and he would probably just continue his abuse, if not amp up his abuse of Laverne. And so the way she saw it is either what she just did was going to end the chapter with John and he was going to go to jail for murder, or Laverne might wind up being the next dead girl on the side of the highway. A little over a week later, on the morning of February 16th, Detective John Ingram sat with his partner in a very clean living room in Wilsonville, Oregon. Ingram was the lead investigator on Tanya Bennett's murder case, and he was there to speak to Laverne, who was sitting on the opposite couch. And Laverne seemed really nervous and kept fidgeting constantly and offering Ingram and his partner refreshments. It was just very clear that there was a lot on this woman's mind. So Ingram knew that Laverne had a week earlier called in a tip about the victim's killer. She thought it was her own boyfriend, John Sosnowski. And right now, Ingram was very eager to hear what she had to say about her boyfriend, to basically elaborate and sort of give the full story of why she believed what she believed, in part because Ingram's case so far had absolutely no other leads. Like, this was it. The victim's body had been found on a grassy slope so close to the edge of the highway that you could see her from the road. But Ingram and his partner had not been able to find any witnesses. A few people had claimed to have seen Tanya along with some man at a bar earlier in the night before she went missing, but no one had been able to effectively describe that man. It was just some guy she was with. And so Ingram and his partner had basically talked to just about anyone they could think of that might have known Tanya. They'd canvassed her neighborhood, they'd interviewed her family, coworkers, friends, and they still had not been able to find anybody who fit as a suspect. They also hadn't found any good physical evidence at the scene, like fingerprints or helpful forensics. So now, Ingram was hoping that Laverne was going to be the key to his whole case. And so eventually, Ingram looked at Laverne and said, "Whenever you're ready, tell me what you know. Tell me the story of why you believe John killed Tanya." Now, at first, Laverne just continued to squirm in her seat, and she was, obviously very nervous, but eventually, after Ingram told her to just, take a breath, calm down, it's okay, we just want to hear your story, eventually, with a shaking voice, she told them that on the night of the murder, John had come home around maybe 1 or 2 in the morning and immediately got in the shower. Now, this was unusual. I mean, this is not something that he typically did. He didn't shower at 2 in the morning. But Laverne really hadn't thought much of it until the next day when they went to a local bar, and she'd literally overheard John bragging to somebody about murdering Tanya, describing how he had picked her up at a truck stop, killed her, then took her to the highway by Columbia River Gorge to dump her body by this scenic overlook. As Laverne spoke, Ingram and his partner were shocked. Basically, Laverne had overheard effectively a confession, and the details of that confession did seem to line up with what they had heard so far. Tanya had been seen out late at night with some man, although nobody could really describe the man. And also where her body was found, it was near the scenic overlook, something that was, publicly known, but still, that's what Laverne heard John say. It lined up. But he kept a poker face and just told Laverne to please keep going, keep elaborating. And so Laverne, she continued speaking, and she went on to say that the reason she didn't come forward right away was because she was scared of John. He was a violent alcoholic who abused her, which is also part of the reason why this seemed real to her. She was totally not shocked at the idea that maybe John killed someone, but she was basically fearful that he might kill her too. And so she had kept it to herself until she had seen the article in the paper and also saw the picture of the girl, and she just looked so young and innocent, and she just couldn't help but feel like she owed it to that girl to come forward. Now, at this point, Ingram's mind was whirling. If this was all true, it was huge for this case. Potentially, this just solved the whole murder. This is what happened potentially. But he also knew, right now, it was just one woman's story. He needed actual proof. He couldn't just take Laverne's word for it. So he asked Laverne if he and his partner could just go ahead and search the apartment. And as soon as Laverne nodded, the detectives jumped to their feet and got to work. Laverne led the detectives down the hallway to the master bedroom, and then from there, she backed off and just, let the men get to work. And the detectives, they immediately split up and spread out to cover more ground. Ingram had actually brought along a list of stuff that they were theoretically looking for. And one of the things on his list was a swatch of denim from the front buttons of Tanya's jeans. It had been missing when they found her, like it had been intentionally cut out, which was obviously pretty unusual. And it made him think that Tanya's killer had taken a trophy or something. But after a few minutes of searching around the bedroom, Ingram did not see this denim patch. In fact, he actually didn't see anything at first glance that connected John to Tanya. Until he went over to look through this cardboard box of papers and began sifting through them. And when he pulled out a torn piece of scrap paper and read what was on it, he froze. On this piece of scrap paper was a handwritten message that just said, quote, "T. Bennett, good piece." Ingram immediately called his partner over, who walked over and looked at the note, and both of them are like, okay, obviously, we need to bring John in right away for a chat. But after leaving the bedroom and walking towards the door to leave, who comes in the front door? None other than John Sosnowski. About an hour later, Ingram sat at an interrogation table in the sheriff's office, staring across it at John. And John had a very confused look on his face, but otherwise seemed relatively calm. Back at the apartment, when John had walked in the door and sort of saw the detectives and didn't know what was going on, Ingram had told him who he was and why he was there. And John had really just seemed surprised, but had quickly agreed to go with them to the station if they wanted to speak to him. But Ingram knew from experience that, just because John was acting very cooperative did not mean he was innocent. Now, Ingram slid a picture of Tanya across the table and asked John if he knew who she was or had anything to do with her murder. And John didn't deny it or act horrified or offended to be asked. He just said he didn't really remember. And when Ingram showed him the note they found in his bedroom that said T. Bennett, good piece on it, John just sort of squinted at it and said he really wasn't sure if he wrote that or not. So these were all very straightforward questions, and it was highly suspicious to Ingram that John apparently just couldn't answer them, at least not cleanly. And really the rest of his interview went the same way, with John giving mostly just vague non-answers to everything Ingram asked, no matter how binary the question was supposed to be. And Ingram was just sort of struck by how nonchalant John seemed whenever he responded, even though, he was being questioned about his connection to a murder. This was not a time to be nonchalant. This was a time to be forthcoming. However, despite Ingram's very high suspicion of John, realistically, the only evidence he had on John, at least at this point, was all circumstantial, and so was not nearly enough to actually arrest John. What they needed in order to do that was some form of hard evidence that directly connected him to Tanya's murder. So ultimately, at the end of this interview, despite how weird the whole thing had been, Ingram just sighed and told John that for now, he could go. 4 days later, Ingram had just gotten to his office for the morning when his desk phone rang. He picked up and was surprised to hear Laverne's voice on the other end. But before he could ask her what this was about, Laverne told him she had found something in her car that morning and felt like he needed to see it. And when she told him what this thing was, Ingram said he would be right over. Then he immediately hung up and ran to find his partner. As he drove to Laverne's, he found his heart was racing. Over the last few days, they hadn't found any additional evidence to prove John was their killer. In fact, if anything, they had actually lost some evidence, since that note they found inside of John's things in his house ended up being a dead end, because their analysts couldn't actually match the handwriting to John, so they didn't know for sure if it was him. But now, based on what Laverne had just told him on the phone about what she found in her car, he was pretty much positive that this was the break he needed. Within the hour, Ingram and his partner were standing in Laverne's garage with Laverne staring into the open trunk of her car. Laverne had told Ingram that she kept her car and really her whole life very, very clean, like her apartment's clean, everything's clean all the time. And when she went into her car that day, she noticed there was a little swatch of denim sitting in the trunk. And she knew that she had not put it there, and considering she was sort of on high alert about John and about his connection to this murder, it just seemed like something worth flagging to police. And for Ingram and his partner, as they're staring into the trunk at this little swatch of denim that looks very much like the swatch of denim they were secretly looking for, they had not publicly revealed that the killer had taken a little swatch of denim from Tanya's jeans. That was private. They're looking at this thinking, oh my goodness, like this is the break we needed. Clearly, That's the denim from Tanya's jeans. And so Laverne was right to call this in. This is potentially huge. Now, obviously, Ingram knew that they would still have to get this denim tested to make sure it really was Tanya's. I mean, it's entirely possible that it was actually Laverne's or John's or was unrelated, but circumstantially, this felt like hitting the jackpot. And so Ingram watched as his partner picked up the swatch, put it into an evidence bag, and then they left and said they would have it tested and they would be in touch. The following morning, Ingram was at his desk reviewing all the evidence that they had so far. And by this point, they had a lot of evidence. The previous night, after finding the denim, they had brought John in for a polygraph test, and he had completely failed it. The test administrator had even noted that, in his opinion, John definitely knew what had happened to Tanya. So now, realistically, Ingram was just sort of waiting on confirmation that that fabric was a match. And then at that point, they could go and arrest John. And when Ingram's phone rang, he picked it up immediately, and it was the lab. And so Ingram sat up straight, ready for some good news. But the tech on the other line sounded sort of glum, and he told Ingram that the denim from Laverne's car did not match the jeans that Tanya was wearing, so it was not hers. And at this, Ingram was just completely stunned. I mean, the idea that they had just found the same unique cut of denim in a car in their main suspect's house could not be a coincidence. I mean, it was not typical for people to have little swatches of denim lying around. Like, this is not something that you just happen to have. It felt sort of specific. And so there just had to be more to this than met the eye. And even though Ingram tried to work out some kind of reasonable explanation for why that swatch was there, the only thing that actually made sense was that the fake denim was planted there. And so feeling a mix of, again, shock, but also just frustration here. I mean, he thought he was so close to solving this thing, and now he was sort of back to square one. Ingram realized that the next stop had to be Laverne's. He needed to go speak to her again. Later that morning, Ingram and his partner were once again back in Laverne's living room with a very nervous-looking Laverne sitting across from them. This time, Ingram was going to be a little tougher on her, because he now knew that, whatever she had told him before very likely was not the full story. And as soon as Ingram asked Laverne point blank if she had planted that evidence, that denim inside of her car, Laverne just kind of looked back at him and her face began to sort of quiver, and then she just started sobbing. And she told him she was so sorry. She explained that she had cut up some jeans and put that front button part in her car and pretended to have found it so that they'd be able to arrest John. She said she had just gotten so worried when they let him go after interviewing him because she knew John killed Tanya. He had to have. She heard him talk about it. Like, he did it and he's dangerous. Then she just wanted to make sure the police held him accountable. Now, when Ingram heard this, he could hear the earnestness in her voice. Like, clearly this woman is scared of John and thinks he did this. She believes he did this. And so he wanted to believe her angle here, as inappropriate as planting evidence was. But, critically, he knew Laverne still was definitely not telling him everything, because there was simply no way she could have known to plant that unique cut of the jeans unless she had intimate knowledge of the crime or some other inside information. But there was just something missing here. Why would she randomly choose that front cut of denim as just the evidence? Oh, here's some evidence that's going to make John look guilty. Why would she choose that? That's way too on the nose. And when he pointed this out to Laverne, it was like Laverne's energy completely shifted, from sobbing and sadness and remorse to just pure hesitation. Like, she didn't really know how to react, but there wasn't any more sadness. It was like, uh-oh, something's off here. And then Laverne kind of took a deep breath and she looked at Ingram and she said, I was lying. You're right. My story about planting the evidence, that was a lie. But she went on to say that the reason she had lied was because she had ultimately been too afraid that if the police knew the whole story, that she would get in trouble too. Then Laverne explained what really happened to Tanya. On the night that Tanya was murdered, Laverne said John called her that night and he was sort of frantic. And he said to her that he was in trouble and that she needed to meet him at the bar that he was at and to bring along a shower curtain. And so Laverne said, because she was very scared of John and, was just fearful of asking any questions, she had just done what he said. And she got the shower curtain and she had driven out there and she found John in a parking lot standing over a body. It was Tanya, and she was just lying there on the ground, motionless. Laverne said she was horrified and didn't know what to do, so she just helped. She literally helped John put Tanya's body into her car, Laverne's car, wrapped her up in that curtain she'd brought along, and then together they dumped her body at a spot along the highway. But as Laverne continued to talk, her story suddenly got much darker, because she actually eventually confessed that actually Tanya had not been dead when she had first arrived, but instead she was still clinging to life. And at John's request, Laverne had tied rope around Tanya's neck and held it tight while John sexually assaulted her. Laverne said after he was done, Tanya was no longer breathing. Ingram could barely conceal his shock when she explained this. I mean, here was this gentle, soft-spoken lady who was now telling him that she had actively participated in the sexual assault and murder of this young woman. It was hard to wrap his head around it. And at the moment, all Ingram could think was, this can't be real. But what Laverne was saying just fit. It explained John's cagey answers to his questions, his failed polygraph, and how Laverne knew the right part of the genes to cut out and fake his evidence, because she and John had been the ones who actually made the cut on Tanya's genes. They knew. But despite getting this earth-shattering confession here, Ingram wanted to be completely sure that this version of the story Laverne was telling him was actually the truth, and he knew exactly how to prove it. The following day, Ingram was behind the wheel of his cruiser next to his partner, and Laverne sat in the back, sort of absent-mindedly staring out the window. They were driving down the highway northeast of Portland, and Ingram had instructed Laverne to let him know when they reached the spot where they dumped Tanya's body. Now, the newspapers had published the general location of where the body had been found, but certainly not specifics. So Ingram knew that if Laverne could point out the exact spot, well, that meant she was telling the truth. As they began to get closer and closer to the spot Ingram knew was the spot, he sort of felt his heart rate pick up, but he didn't drive any faster or slower. He didn't signal that it was coming up. He just kept on driving, steady, going straight, sort of expecting Laverne to call it out any moment. But the cruiser drove right past the actual spot where the body had been found, and Laverne didn't say anything. For a few minutes, they just kept on driving down the road in total silence, and Ingram's feeling really disappointed here. And as they're driving along, suddenly Laverne says, "Hey, wait a minute, turn around." So Ingram did, and soon they were headed back the way they'd come. And this time, when they passed the actual crime scene, so the actual spot where Tanya had been found, Laverne called it out and said that's where she was. Stop. As Ingram parked the car, he looked back at Laverne, who was staring intently out the window, right at the exact spot on that slope right off the highway where the body had been found. Then, once they were parked, all three of them got out of the car, and Laverne went over to the edge of the road and pointed, like right to the exact spot where Tanya had been found on this slope. And even though Ingram tried to keep his expression neutral here, internally he was sort of amazed. I mean, clearly Laverne was telling the truth. It would have been impossible for her to have chosen that specific spot without having prior knowledge of where Tanya had been, meaning she was telling the truth. She must have been involved in killing Tanya. As they all climbed back into the car, Ingram knew they now had more than enough to formally arrest John and also Laverne. She'd done the right thing by coming forward, but of course now there were going to be consequences. On February 21st, so 16 days after Laverne called with her first tip, John Sosnovsky was arrested. And 5 days after that, Laverne was arrested as well, and both of them were charged with murder. About 11 months later, Laverne's trial started, and at that point, Laverne actually tried to change her story again. She tried to recant her confession and said, "No, I didn't actually do this." But the jury didn't buy her change of heart and convicted her of murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison. As for John, 2 months after Laverne's sentencing, he was given the same sentence, life in prison. And that should have been the end of the case, at least from the legal perspective. But for the next 3 years following sentencing, Ingram just couldn't stop thinking about Laverne and John and Tanya Bennett. Despite what Laverne had done, he felt a lot of empathy for her. She'd obviously been under John's control and had seemed genuinely terrified of him. But more than that, Ingram had this horrible, nagging feeling that they'd gotten something wrong here. Then, one March afternoon in 1994, Ingram was in his office at the sheriff's department going over some paperwork when his desk phone rang. When he picked it up, it was the prosecutor who'd worked Tanya's case. And the prosecutor said they'd just gotten a very strange letter about Tanya's murder. And as soon as the prosecutor described the letter's contents, Ingram felt sick to his stomach. Ingram had been right to worry that he and his partner and really the whole legal system had potentially just gotten something wrong with this case. It just felt like there was something left unsaid. There was some loophole, there was some loose end something, but he didn't know what it was. It would turn out the thing that was wrong was Laverne, because their star witness, Laverne, was not just this sweet older lady afraid of her abusive boyfriend who had come forward and told the truth despite the consequences. That wasn't really the story. In fact, basically everything she told Ingram and his partner was a lie. What was true, and what ultimately drove Laverne to do what she did, was she really wanted to break up with John, but she didn't know how to do it. And so what she ultimately did to attempt to rid herself of John was to frame him for murder. And at first, she did an incredible job. She read everything she could, little details about the murder in the news. She also snuck a peek at Ingram's list of evidence during that early interview that was done at her apartment, and so that's how she knew about, that swatch of denim they were looking for. And she also just happened to take a few really lucky guesses, like when she pointed out the spot on the side of the highway where the body was found, she just guessed, but it happened to be right. However, the problem was, despite, basically nailing the framing of John and getting him wrapped up with a murder conviction, she also sort of inadvertently implicated herself. When she came out and said, well, I participated in the murder, her thinking was, they'll take pity on me and they'll blame John, he'll go to jail and I'll be okay. But no, she also got convicted of murder and went to jail as well. And Laverne and John were literally in prison, basically riding out their life sentences, when the actual killer, the real Tanya Bennett killer, sent a letter to authorities confessing to his crime. That was why that prosecutor called Ingram. It was to tell him, I think there's been a mistake. They clearly didn't do it. After the real killer was arrested in 1995, Laverne and John were both released from prison. In total, they both served 4 years in jail, all because of Laverne's lies. Our second and final story is called The Intruder. One morning in early November of 2023, a 71-year-old woman named Patrice Miller stood in front of her fridge in her little home in the rural town of Downeyville, California, and she saw she was running low on food, which meant it was time to place an order with the market in town, which delivered her groceries for her. Getting her food delivered was essential for Patrice and where she was at in her life right now. She lived alone and had a whole house to take care of, which was definitely getting harder the older she got. She'd also had some health problems lately, so it was getting more difficult just to move around. She even had a walking stick just to prop herself up. As Patrice stood in front of her fridge, wondering what she was going to add to her grocery list, she heard one of her 2 cats meowing outside. And this reminded her that amongst some other chores, she needed to feed her cats. So she decided to make her list later, and she just closed the fridge door, put some cat food in a bowl, and then grabbed her walking stick and headed outside. Patrice carried the cat food out onto the porch. She had some other things to do outside, but she couldn't hold a lot of things at once because of her walking stick. So once she had put the bowl down, she then headed back inside to get her compost, and then took that back outside to her garden. And she tried to do all these outdoor chores really quickly because she didn't like being outside these days. She had lived in Downeyville for a long time, but over the past few years, it had gotten really dangerous there. Now, she hadn't realized how bad it was at first because she mostly kept to herself, but eventually she learned that her neighbors were starting to get intruders on their property. There had also been a clear uptick in vandalism in people's yards and to their homes. And in fact, over the past few months, Patrice herself had begun to experience this directly. In fact, she had dealt with so many attempted break-ins at her own house that she had become convinced that she had a stalker. She'd even put bars on her windows as a security measure. So that's why Patrice did not like being outside. She felt exposed, like her stalker or whoever it was that was doing this was going to be watching her and would come over here and attack. And so, as fast as she could, she dumped the compost in her garden, turned around, hustled inside, and shut the door behind her. And as soon as she had done that and was safely inside her house, she felt hugely relieved. A few days later, on November 8th, at the market in town where Patrice typically got her groceries, a 55-year-old cashier named Cassie Koch rang up a customer at the register. But as she bagged their purchases, her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about Patrice. Cassie was typically the person that delivered Patrice's grocery order, but over the years, they had become closer than just a customer-provider relationship. They were friends. In fact, these days, the two of them would speak on the phone fairly often, just to chat. But now, Cassie realized she hadn't heard from Patrice in days, which was very odd, both because of their friendship, but also because she knew it had been a while since Patrice made her grocery order. And so Cassie had begun asking around at the store and had found out that nobody else had heard from Patrice either. Now, Cassie knew it was possible that Patrice was just busy, and for pretty much anybody else, one missed order or even a couple missed orders wouldn't be enough to make Cassie worry. But in this case, Cassie was extra concerned because she knew about Patrice's stalker, and she knew that Patrice had even called the authorities about it, but they really hadn't been much help. Remember, this is a tiny rural town in California that had experienced a lot of exactly what Patrice was experiencing: break-ins, harassment, and other kinds of vandalism or damage. However, neither Patrice nor anybody else had reported any actual violence. So authorities were basically overwhelmed with a flood of what they considered sort of relatively minor complaints. And Patrice's situation really didn't seem much worse than anybody else's in town. And also, officials just didn't have the manpower to deal with it. And so ultimately, all authorities did was just advise Patrice on ways she could handle it herself, which was why she'd installed those bars on her windows. All this is to say, Cassie knew that Patrice was genuinely terrified of her stalker, who Patrice referred to as Big Bastard. And she was worried about what the stalker might do next. So, after Cassie was done with her shift that day, she tried to get in touch with Patrice one more time. But when she couldn't reach her yet again, Cassie called the police and asked them to go do a wellness check. That evening, a deputy from the Sierra County Sheriff's Department drove up to Patrice's house and parked in front. And immediately, he could tell something was wrong. The front door of her house was clearly smashed in, and there was a garden hose that was laying across her porch steps and was spraying water everywhere, like the water had just been left on. And so the deputy got out of his cruiser and he walked over to the house and he found the turnoff for the water on the side of the house. And then he walked up the front steps of the porch. And as he did this, he was constantly looking around and listening, trying to figure out what was going on here. I mean, he didn't know if there was an active threat inside the house. He had no idea what he was walking into. And so he's on the porch, and before going in through the front door, which was obviously, smashed open, he looked in a window to see if he could see into the house to gauge what was going on here. And when he looked inside the house, the first thing he saw was blood all over the floor. And at that point, he unholstered his gun. And so now, with his gun raised, the deputy stepped into the house. And he slowly walked through the living room, listening for any signs of sudden movement or an indication there was someone still in the house, but he didn't hear anything. And so there didn't appear to be an intruder present right now, but there was also no sign of Patrice. All he saw was that blood towards the front of the house. That was it. And so the deputy, he left the living room and walked towards the kitchen. And as soon as he stepped across the threshold into the kitchen, he breathed in and just kind of held his breath because what he saw was just chaos. All the cabinets were open. And all over the floor were remnants of all the food that likely was in the cabinets, like pieces of food and ripped up packaging and broken jars. A window at the far end of the room was also smashed, and the security bars that Patrice had put on the window were bent and hanging by their hinges. There was actually so much just debris and just chaos in the kitchen that at first, the deputy didn't register what was actually laying in the center of the kitchen on the floor. But then, when his brain sort of processed it, he realized what he was looking at was Patrice. At least, what was left of her. But she no longer looked human, because her body had literally been torn apart. The deputy quickly left the house and called in his terrible discovery to the sheriff. And within an hour, Patrice's property was swarming with police and crime scene techs and a forensic expert who specialized in this type of scene, and detectives fanned out all across the area and began speaking to Patrice's neighbors. And because pretty much everyone in the neighborhood had been experiencing the same type of break-ins and property damage that Patrice had been, it actually didn't take long for police to develop a profile of Patrice's killer. Their conclusion was that very likely the killer was the same individual who was harassing everybody else. But what officials couldn't understand is, why had everybody else experienced effectively minor vandalism, but Patrice went from minor vandalism to really excessive violence? And this required developing a profile of Patrice. And so as police searched for her killer, they were also working on reconstructing Patrice's movements on the final day of her life. And at first, in their efforts, really they were just stumped. I mean, all she had done on that day, as far as they could tell, were some basic chores. But as they dug into what those chores consisted of, they found two things that actually explained everything. It would turn out that every day for the past couple of years, Patrice had been making two terrible mistakes. She fed her cats out on the porch, and she emptied her compost into the garden. And these two actions ultimately were what sort of attracted her stalker, Big Bastard, to her home. Because Big Bastard was a black bear. He loved to eat cat food and kitchen compost scraps. And eventually, he decided that Patrice was food too. So on that day in early November of 2023, when Patrice fed her cats and emptied her compost for the last time, Big Bastard waited until Patrice was in bed and then broke into her house and savagely killed her. By the time the deputy arrived at Patrice's home, Big Bastard had been eating Patrice's body for days, and so what he saw in the kitchen was what was left of her. Black bears are not typically dangerous to people. In fact, Patrice was the first known black bear fatality in California history. But it was exactly that sort of lack of perceived danger, which is why officials didn't help Patrice or any of her other neighbors get rid of these black bears when they were coming into their neighborhood and causing all this property damage and all this alarm. They basically said, what's the worst they could do? Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Story editing by Evan Allen. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio, Perry Crowell, and Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.